In the 1930s, there was some degree of stability within the Middle East. Like in Turkey and Persia, Ataturk and Reza Shah continued to develop secular nations, while brothers Faisal and Abdullah ruled in Iraq and Jordan, Ibn Saud ruled in Arabia, Ibn Yahya in Yemen, and Egypt had gained their independence. There were some changes in power during this time, like in 1933 Faisal of Iraq died, but he was peacefully replaced by his son Ghazi I, and all of these leaders had crushed rebellions in breakaway states, like the Kurdish Ararat Republic in Turkey or the Ilkwan in Saudi Arabia. Even the Europeans had ended the Syrian revolt, the Rif rebellion in Morocco, and the Italians had brutally pacified Libya. However, the world would be struck by the Great Depression. This weakened many of the newly modernizing states, but also pushed them into looking for further streams of income, notably in oil. And leaders across the Islamic world would watch events in Europe with some degree of hope, as Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy presented them with an alternative power who could potentially help in their bid for independence. For instance, over in Afghanistan, Mohammad Zahir Shah came to the throne with some trouble, but far more peacefully than anything beforehand. He also inherited a somewhat developed state and an army of 40,000 soldiers. But he was still young, so initially his uncle, Mohammad Hashim Khan, took over running the country. He quickly began aligning with the Nazis, and in 1935, German businessmen began appearing in the country. As his country began to grow richer, he had bold plans for across his eastern border. Their Muslim Uyghurs had risen up in China and formed the East Turkestan Republic. Zahir Shah sent some soldiers to protect their emir, Muhammad Amin Bugra. But this state became the center of much stranger political events. He, like many Republicans, had largely dropped the idea, but those who were still loyal to the House of Osman were still proving to be supporters of pan-Turkism. So a pan-Turkic state in Asia could lead to Ataturk's position being weakened internationally. He therefore decided to aid the Chinese government, and so too did the Nazis. The Soviets meanwhile had their own puppets in the region, and all the various ethnicities began to clash. There was even Tawfik Bey, who was a Syrian in the service of Ibn Saud, who seems to have joined in as well. The Japanese also sensed an opportunity and wanted to create their own puppet state. Many Turks already saw Japan as the future liberators of the colonized world, while some even saw the two nations as tied together under the pan-Turanist umbrella, along with the Finns, the Hungarians, Koreans, and more. Inside Japan, exiled Turks formed the Idel-Ural Society alongside some Manchurians, and they found a new champion in the exiled Ottoman prince Abdul Karim. The Japanese planned on helping to install him onto the throne of a Turkic state in Xinjiang, which even Ataturk described as a Muslim Manchukuo. But the Soviets moved in quickly and installed their own puppet, and these plans were shelved. Japan's attention was of course focused elsewhere afterwards, and so too was Afghanistan's, who would in later years look towards taking parts of Pakistan. But over the border in Persia, Reza Shah had continued with his secular reforms. In 1935 at the Gorhashad Mosque, the clergy denounced his heretical rule, but they were crushed and Reza Shah pushed on regardless. And much like in Afghanistan, he too began to look towards the fascists. For instance, he only allowed Lufthansa Airlines to fly in Persian airspace, and the Italians trained his naval officers on board Italian ships that he had bought. He was also finally able to bring many of the old foreign-owned businesses under national control, like printing money was taken away from the British Imperial Bank. Foreigners were also banned from owning land and travelling to the provinces without permission. He, like all the leaders of the Middle East, still needed foreign money though. So when building the huge railway line from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, he chose investors who historically had no interest in the lands, like the Scandinavians, the Americans, and the Germans. His most drastic action though was to cancel the Darcy oil concession. His motives haven't necessarily been agreed upon, but it seems he just wanted to renegotiate the terms in the wake of dipping revenues during the Great Depression. Or he could have just been fighting back against the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which did engage in many practices that undermined the Shah. For instance, they sold oil to the British Admiralty for a discounted price, and this of course would limit his share of the money. So the terms were renegotiated, increasing his share in the profits from 16% to 20%, and Britain continued on extracting Persian oil. Yet throughout all of this, Nazi Germany quickly became Persia's largest trading partner by the end of the decade. And I really shouldn't say Persia anymore, as it was in this period that they changed their name to Iran. This name literally means the land of the Aryans, and Iranians had been referring to themselves and their lands as this for centuries. However, they only officially requested that their name be changed in the 1930s, and this could have something to do with the Nazis. Hitler, for instance, declared that Iranians were pure-blooded Aryans in 1936, and said that they were exempt from the Nuremberg laws. They founded a newspaper known as Iran Bastion and hired many locals to spread their message, like Davud Monshazadeh, who even fought for the SS during the war. There were, however, still communists in the nation, despite the fall of the Persian Soviet in the north. Many of these, like Iraj Eskandari, had studied in Berlin, but he was arrested along with 52 other communists in 1938. Some of these men would die in prison in Tehran, while others were subject to show trials similar to Stalin's. Eskandari, though, would survive, and would later found the Tudeh party. Moving further west in Turkey, Ataturk wasn't necessarily in favour of one alliance or another. Turkey was, after all, stuck between a group of countries all rearming and posing a threat to his nation. While at home, it's pretty hard to place Ataturk into a camp, be it communist, fascist or liberal. As he himself said, "I do not leave any verses, any dogmas, nor any frozen and moulded principles as spiritual heritage. My spiritual heritage is science and reason." As such, he embarked on a Soviet-style 5-year plan to modernize his country, but also gained praise from Hitler for his nationalist agenda. He also developed a one-party state, created a cult of personality, but also westernized his nation and pushed a secular agenda. So his foreign policy was often equally hard to pin down. At the beginning, he was close to the Soviet Union, who aided his wars against the Greeks, and they had signed a non-aggression pact back in 1925. But he began to fear Soviet designs in the east, so Ataturk turned west and made a deal with Mussolini in 1928. However, this came at a time when Ataturk's plans on Mosul had been stopped by the British. Mussolini then tried to extend this into an alliance with the Greeks, and relations were normalized in 1930. But the Turks then began to fear Mussolini and his possible plans on Anatolia. This was made worse when in 1933, Mussolini made a pact with the Soviets and later attacked Ethiopia. Ataturk was also skeptical of any dealings with the Germans, who had often asserted control over Ottoman troops in the last war. Yet he still accepted German technical advice and loans, and Germany became a major trading partner, but he tried to counteract this by inviting the British to invest and construct steel and iron mills. This way, no one country held a monopoly, and they couldn't pressure Turkey alone. Yet again, it should be said that Hitler was a keen admirer of Ataturk, allegedly saying, "Ataturk was the first to show that it is possible to modernize and regenerate the resources that a country has lost. In this respect, Ataturk was a teacher, Mussolini was his first, and I his second student." But this admiration was not reciprocal. Some of Ataturk's later reforms, though, continue to be praised by the Nazis, like a campaign to force all of the citizens of the country to speak Turkish. Or in 1934, there was a resettlement program which aimed at Turkifying every province in the nation. As Sukrukaya said, "This law will create a country speaking with one language, thinking in the same way and sharing the same sentiment." The many Muslim migrants and refugees from the Balkans were then spread thinly around the provinces, so they'd lose their unique identities. For instance, many Bulgarian Muslims had settled in Thrace, and therefore the Bulgarians could claim this territory later on. However, if they were spread out among all of Turkey, they could not do so. Also, by splitting up the Kurds and other groups, they'd stop further rebellions. But, of course, such nationalistic policies had their own problems, like it prompted pogroms in Thrace. Supposedly, the local governors thought the new program intended to break up the Jewish populations as well, and in such a climate, pogroms began, forcing 15,000 to flee the region. Yet, internationally around the same time, Ataturk turned towards the Allies, and along with the Greeks, they proposed creating a Mediterranean pact. At this point, the Mosul question had already been settled, Ataturk had signed a treaty with the French in 1926, and Turkey joined the League of Nations in 1932. The Allies then signed the Montreux Convention, allowing Turkey to remilitarize the Straits, and this helped keep the Turks on their side as the Nazis grew in power in Europe, but it angered the Soviets. Ataturk therefore wanted to finally secure his western border with the Balkan Entente, which was signed with Greece, Romania and Yugoslavia. This was specifically targeted against Turkey's old ally Bulgaria, who were beginning to rearm and look towards possibly reconquering lost lands. Yet, Ataturk, knowing that the Allies were determined to keep him on their side, was actually able to make some gains in the south around Hatay. This land he described back in 1923 as a homeland where Turks lived for centuries and can't be a captive at the hands of an enemy. But to understand this situation, we need to look at Syria. Here, the French had in 1923 managed to agree to a constitution with many nationalist leaders, like Hashim al-Atassi and Ibrahim Hanunu. The two sides then began to negotiate independence, but one that would be very gradual and would allow the French to keep the Syrian mountains. However, in 1936, Hanunu died, and the nationalist bloc held commemorations for him. The French responded to this by arresting many of their leaders, which in turn led to the Syrians going on strike. Soldiers then fired at the crowds and arrested over 3,000 people. By this point though, within France itself, left-wing groups were growing more powerful and demanding an end to colonialism, or at least a change in their methods. It would in fact only be a couple months later that the Popular Front headed by Leon Blum would come to power. They invited al-Atassi to discuss independence again, and they agreed that his national bloc would achieve it gradually and maintain some sort of control over the Druze and Alawite states. Atassi returned home a hero as the first true president of the Republic, but this was short-lived. The French were now too worried about Germany, so delayed ratifying the treaty. This led to condemnation from many old Syrian nationalists, like Abd al-Rahman Shah Bandar, causing rifts in the national bloc. And to make matters worse for them, this is when the Hatay issue was brought up. The population of the province at this time is estimated to have been around 46% Arab, 39% Turkish, and 11% Armenian, with the rest being Circassian, Kurds, and Jews. In 1936, two Syrian Arabs won the elections, as Turks and Arabs fought one another in the streets. Ataturk then appealed to the League of Nations, and again, the Allies gave in to his requests. They prepared for a new constitution and held a referendum in 1939. Many, however, call this completely rigged, as the Turks sent tens of thousands of people from their own country to vote in it, while the French largely let it happen. Al-Atassi resigned in protest, thousands began demonstrating, but the annexation went ahead and Hatay became part of Turkey. But it was not Ataturk who celebrated this, as he died in 1938 and was replaced by İsmet İnönü, who continued leading the country down much of the same path. The Syrians though had now lost land, and it had been confirmed that they would not unite with Lebanon, as they had signed a similar treaty with France, paving their way to independence. Here the situation was more stable for the French, as Charles de Bass had been president from 1926 to 34. And as a pro-French Greek Christian, he continued to work alongside them. He appointed Maronites like Emile Ede and Bechara al-Khoury to be prime minister, often switching between the two. And when there were challenges to this setup, like when Mohammed al-Jazir ran for president in 1932, the French just cancelled the constitution and de Bass continued in his role. Emile Ede would take over the country from 1936 to 41, and he had fought with the French during the last war, and again, just continued working alongside them. He, like many, did push for independence, albeit a very gradual one, and an independence free from the ideas of Arab unity. In fact, for decades, Christians in Lebanon had been at the forefront of Arab nationalism, but in recent years they were pushing forward the idea that they were the descendants of the Phoenicians and were very different from the Arabs. 1936 though proved to be a crucial year elsewhere in the Islamic world, and as I explain it, it's important to bear in mind the aspirations of the Italians and the Germans. The Italians in particular were looking to reclaim lands all over the Mediterranean as part of Mare Nostrum, and in 1935 they launched their invasion of Ethiopia. Mussolini though had tried to position himself as almost a saviour of Islam, even though he had killed thousands in Libya. Yet in Tripoli a couple years later, he would be given the Sword of Islam by Yusuf Keresk, a Berber supporter of his. Inside the city a monument was also built for him, with the description reading, "To Benito Mussolini, peacemaker of the people, redeemer of the land of Libya." He, like other right-wing leaders like Hitler and even Franco, were remarkably fond of Islam in general, and could always use their friendship to undermine the Allies. But Italian expansion in particular worried the Egyptians, who were being ruled by Ismail Sidki. He was sort of a dictator as he suspended the constitution, but he was forced to resign in 1933, and once again power switched hands, and after intense protests, the constitution was brought back in. Yet in 1936, King Fuad died, and his young son Farhud came to the throne. His father was actually quite keen on forming an alliance with the Italians, but now the young Farhud was actually studying in Britain when his father died. With him in power, the British again began to negotiate the Treaty of 1922, extending the time that their troops could remain to defend the Suez Canal. And fortunately for the British, as Italy invaded Ethiopia and claimed Egypt and Sudan, this even pushed the nationalist Wafd Party into making a deal. Many did protest this, but over 100 people were killed and the treaty was still signed. It allowed the British to remain around the canal inside Sudan, and in times of war, they could use Egyptian airspace, ports and roads for the next 20 years at least, while Egypt builds an army capable of defending the canal by themselves. There was, however, yet another emerging power in Egypt. This began with Ahmad Hussein, who was angry that the fez was produced abroad. He tried raising money to build a factory in Egypt himself, and he promoted yet another form of nationalism, and his group, Young Egypt, modelled itself on European fascism. His followers in their green shirts paraded in the streets and allegedly received Italian funding. And in these early days, a young Gamal Abdul Nasser joined the party before they were banned. Hussein, though, had his own unique ideologies. He believed that Egypt should return to true Islamic society, when there was no employer and no employee, but all were brothers cooperating together. He actually believed Hitler had managed to achieve this, but later said Hitler is a madman who wishes to destroy the world in order to satisfy his arrogance and his desires. Regardless, Britain had signed a deal with Egypt and France with Syria. Both of these came in 1936, and that same year, there would be a coup in Iraq. To understand this, we need to look at the Similey massacre, which targeted the Assyrians in the north in 1933. The Assyrians had already angered many Muslims back in 1924 when they committed a massacre of their own in Kirkuk, and as they had long worked with the British, they were seen as agents of empire, and possibly looking to divide the country. Well, in 1932, the British granted Iraq their independence, but again retained military bases and control over the Assyrian troops, some of the best soldiers in Iraq. Shamun Ashai, the patriarch of the Catholic Assyrians, tried to gain autonomy before the British mandate ended, but failed. So many leaders within the Assyrian levies, like Malik Yaqub, convinced his followers to deny Iraqi citizenship. The new Prime Minister, Rashid Ali al-Gaylani, invited the patriarch to meet with him in Baghdad, but arrested him as soon as he arrived. Gaylani, by the way, had joined with other prominent leaders, like al-Hashimi, to form the Party of National Brotherhood. They were opposed to any concessions to the British, and Gaylani would later try to turn Iraq into an Axis power. Yaqub and his band of followers then tried to flee to Syria and clashed with the Iraqi forces near the border. No one really knows who started the attack, but the Iraqis jumped at the chance to spread stories of Christian atrocities, including the poisoning of drinking water. Bakir Sidki then led troops north, and in August 1933 around Duhok, his troops began massacring the Assyrians. Nearby Kurds, Yazidis and Arabs joined in looting the towns, as most Assyrians fled to the town of Similey. There they persuaded the Assyrians to disarm before the Iraqis fired among them until not a man was left standing in the shambles. Men were dragged out and shot or bludgeoned to death, and their bodies thrown on a pile of dead. King Faisal died shortly after the massacre, so the following celebrations held in Mosul were attended by his son Ghazi, who handed out decorations to the participants. Ghazi, by the way, was an open pan-Arab nationalist, and again would be keen on dealing with the Axis. The British, meanwhile, were seen as betraying the Assyrians in favour of appeasing the Iraqi government, which by now was also anti-British. Otherwise, an Iraqi historian named Kanan Makiya argued that this massacre was the peculiar origin of a sort of Iraqi nationalism. This is because Kurds, Sunni Arabs, Yazidis, Shia Arabs, Republicans, monarchists and more all united to stamp out the Christian Assyrians. However, this seems far too simple, as within 2 years, the Kurds, Yazidis and the Shia would rebel. Well, the Kurds really just fought against themselves, but the Yazidis would rebel against conscription laws. Again though, Bakir Sidki arrived and killed a couple hundred people and then imposed martial law. Then across central Iraq, the Shia Muslims were feeling more and more excluded from politics and just generally ignored. After some small uprising, the Iraqi government arrested a prominent Shia cleric, causing the rebellions to spread further. They continued until late 1936, when, again, Bakir Sidki came in and crushed the fragmented tribes. By this point, the British were describing Sidki as the best commander in Iraq. However, he was a Kurd, and he promoted many Kurds to high-ranking positions. But despite all of his achievements, he began to feel slighted because he was not promoted even further. And although he often worked with the National Brotherhood Party, Iraq, like elsewhere, didn't have long-serving prime ministers. From the beginning of 1933 to the end of 1935, there was Naji Shawak, Al-Gaylani, Jamil al-Midfai, Ali Jawdat al-Ayubi, al-Midfai again, and finally al-Hashimi. Well, Sidki had been instrumental in toppling Ayubi, as when the Shia rebelled, they demanded his resignation. Sidki then refused to move against them until he agreed to leave office. Al-Hashimi would be appointed to help quell the uprising, and he began to transform into a dictator, ruling by decree, expanding the police and shutting down newspapers. But it was the fact that he didn't promote Sidki that proved to be his demise. Sidki moved into Baghdad when Hashimi was on a trip and forced other leaders, like Nouri al-Said, to flee to Cairo. However, he did make a crucial mistake in killing Jafar al-Askari. He was very popular in the army, having been an early leader in the Arab revolt, and with his death, many began to see this coup as anti-Arab, especially as the newly installed Prime Minister, Hikmat Suleiman, was a Turkmen. Sidki though held the real power, and he tried to emulate Ataturk and Reza Shah, and he was also set to become part of a huge Islamic alliance known as the Sabadat Pact. This was actually put forward by Mohammad Zahir Shah of Afghanistan and would stretch from Istanbul to Kabul, but it was only really possible with a Kurd in power in Iraq, as many of the Arab nationalists still had claims to lands in Turkey and Iran, like Khuzestan. So this was a sort of non-Arab Islamic alliance. Also, this military coup is said to be the first in modern Arab history, and would of course be followed by dozens more. But it didn't last very long. In August 1937 in Mosul, Sidki was assassinated. Yet the motivation behind it is disputed. Some claim it was Nouri and the British, others say it was angry army officers, but really there's dozens of groups who would want to get rid of him. The pro-British Nouri al-Said would eventually take over in 1938, however, many still demanded full independence from Britain. And within the country, Prince Grover convinced the king to send Iraqi officers to train in Germany. He even purchased a newspaper called the Arab World, broadcast Radio Berlin in Arabic, and translated Mein Kampf. All of this positioned Germany as the potential saviour of Iraq. So when the officers returned from Germany, fully convinced of this, 4 of the highest ranking officers formed the Golden Circle, and they would make a move for power. Meanwhile, over in Palestine, again in 1936, Britain was about to face its greatest challenge to date. Jewish migrants continued arriving and buying up land. Governor Warchop, the High Commissioner, warned that this would serve as a focus of discontent and might even result in serious disorders. But in his years in charge, he still allowed the Jewish population to increase from 175,000 to 325,000 between 1931 and 35. These Jewish people were divided into different groups, all with very different ideologies and even paramilitaries. There were still many Bolsheviks in Palestine, and they, along with the moderates, favoured a more peaceful policy with the Arabs, known as Havlagar. This was the doctrine of Haganah, the main paramilitary group, who favoured defence rather than attack, hoping to keep the British on side. But alongside them, there were also revisionist Zionists, who believed a Jewish state should also include Jordan, and they believed in Palestine only violence could establish a Jewish state. They had some supporters in Britain like the MP Josiah Wedgwood, who wanted Palestine to become a dominion like Canada or Australia. By the 1930s, their leader Jabotinsky had already been arrested by the British and barred from re-entering Palestine. Yet he still formed his own Zionist Congress to further these goals, and their activities were pretty global. Like the Batar movement was said to have around 40,000 followers in Poland, all training in military drills. However, their actions there are somewhat controversial. On the one hand, they helped defend Jews from many anti-Semitic attacks, but also they began to copy many aspects of fascism and even worked with some fascist leaders. For instance, they signed the Havara Agreement with the Nazis in 1933. This allowed some 60,000 Jews to flee Germany to Palestine and bring some of their assets with them. Well, technically they could use the value of their assets to purchase German-made goods that would then be used to settle in Palestine. This, however, was met with condemnation, as it allowed the Germans to make money despite an international anti-Nazi boycott. Then in 1936, Jabotinsky planned on evacuating 1.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe and bring them into Palestine. The Poles, Hungarians and Romanians all agreed, but the British vetoed the idea, believing it would be disastrous to Palestine. Some, though, say that Jabotinsky predicted the Holocaust and tried to save as many Jews as possible. But then again, he also worked with Mussolini by setting up the Bataan Naval Academy in 1934 to train up Zionists. Yet they did break off relations with Mussolini when he joined Hitler in an alliance. Regardless, the arrival of huge numbers of Jews in Palestine and the development of cities broke down the old Arab clan system. Many Arabs flocked to the cities and largely lived in shanty towns. As resentment continued to grow, so too did organizations trying to mobilize the people, especially after the violence of the late 1920s. Tarab Abdul Hadi, for instance, created a feminist movement which included both Christians and Muslims. In a famous speech she said, "The mothers, daughters, sisters of the Arab victims are gathered here to make the world witness the betrayal of the British. We want all the Arabs to remember that the British are the cause of our suffering." A number of political groups also began to emerge, like the Independence Party in 1932, which was inspired by Gandhi and advocated for a boycott. However, these political parties were mainly the domain of the rich and the educated, and their parties were divided along old family lines who had contended for power for decades, like the Husseini family who funded the Palestinian Arab Party. There was also the Khalidi family. They had remained loyal to the Ottomans during the war, and many of them served as mayor of Jerusalem, like Hussein al-Khalidi in 1934, who founded the Reform Party. After him came Mustafa al-Khalidi in 1938. He, however, was accused of being a Zionist himself when he said of the Jews, "They cannot be thrown into the sea." Likewise, some of them have bought land and received deeds in exchange for money, and we must recognize them. Plus, there was the Nashashibi party. They once again had held power for centuries, being appointed guardians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the 15th century. In modern times, Raghib al-Nashashibi founded the National Defense Party. Now, all of these groups largely had the same ideas, but these old familial ties divided them into different groups. Meanwhile, a Syrian preacher named Izz ad-Din al-Qassam formed the militant Black Hand Secret Society. This band of poor Arabs were then trained in fighting and also in virtues, like giving to the poor and praying regularly. As he built up his forces, some members like Abu Ibrahim al-Kabir wanted to speed up the revolt, and it seems that he just led some attacks on Jews beginning in 1931. As they ambushed a kibbutz and bombed others, al-Qassam waited, building up a force of around 500 men. Then they received news of an illegal shipment of arms arriving, which would then be sent over to the Haganah paramilitary. Al-Qassam believed this was the time to strike, but he had no support from any of the major political groups, and it is said that he only had a dozen or so rifles. But he gave a speech denouncing the British and disappeared into the hills. Shortly afterwards, a policeman was found dead near his base, so the British, in response, overran his position and killed him, angering many Arabs. That April, his followers shot a couple of Jews around Nabta, triggering Jewish demonstrations and revenge attacks, and then the violence just spread. Inspired by events in Syria, the Arab Higher Committee was formed, and they called for a general strike, and later they refused to pay taxes. This committee was founded by Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, and it included many of his old opponents. But the British just ignored their demands, and this forced the Arabs to take up arms and attack British oil and train lines, along with Jewish settlements, burning down acres of farmland. In response, the British then just equipped Jewish units to join their forces and also their searches, where they arrested and tortured many, forcing even more to become rebels. The British even began to round up Arabs in the Auja al-Hafiyah camp. This in turn encouraged Arabs from abroad to join in the rebellion, like Fawzi al-Kawukji, who had fought against the French in Syria. Now, however, he was the leader of the Iraqi Society for the Defense of Palestine, and he led just a few dozen men across the border. There were other foreigners as well, like Hamad Saab, who led Lebanese troops, and Mohammed al-Ashma, who led troops from Transjordan. However, once again, internal divisions plagued the Arab cause, as the Grand Mufti began to grow wary of their power, and Fawzi slipped across the Jordan River and away. Otherwise, after some heavy fighting like at Nur Shams in June, the British were able to call on their Islamic allies in Jordan, Iraq and Saudi Arabia to pressure for a ceasefire, and Lord Peel was brought in to try and find some sort of solution. He, for the first time, brought up the idea of partitioning the lands, granting the Jews coastal towns, and leaving Jerusalem in British hands to maintain the rights of every religious group. However, this plan would result in 225,000 Arabs being forced out of their homes, something most in the British government refused to go along with, and, obviously, the Arab leaders and the revisionist Zionists rejected it. Plus, peace was broken in 1937 when the Arabs killed Louis Yelland Andres, an Australian commissioner who was also a Zionist. By now, though, the revisionist Zionists were forming their own large paramilitaries, like the Irgun, which would target both the Arabs and the British. Jabotinsky, along with other leaders like Robert Bitka, then ordered a huge strike on November the 14th, known as Black Sunday. A series of bombs across the region killed 10 Arabs, and from here on out, they would continue to bomb Arab neighbourhoods and markets. But the British still focused on ending Arab violence first. Many Arab leaders were arrested, while al-Husseini fled the country. The borders were then closed, more camps were opened, and they set up the Arab investigation centres to interrogate and often torture the locals for information. In fact, many of the early leaders of MI5 and Mossad were present here, like Roy van Zaslaini, who gathered a great deal of information. Troops were then brought in from Egypt, and they recruited even more Jews into their special night squads. Together they took over strongholds in Jerusalem and imposed collective fines on communities, leaving them in further poverty. This poverty was made even worse by the jihad tax that they had to pay to the rebels. In some cases, the British would just blow up entire villages as punishment, like Miar in October 1938. When British soldiers were killed, there were instances of swift and cruel retribution. Like in Halhul, they locked civilians in cages in the sun, and in Al-Bassa, when soldiers struck a mine, they ordered the local men to board a bus, and that bus was driven across mines. With the rebellion now clearly failing, many Arabs joined the Nashashibi units, which fought against their fellow Arabs. As the name suggests, they were led by Raghib al-Nashashibi, who sought a leadership position once Husseini had fled. By 1939, though, most of the rebel strongholds had fallen, and it was clear that war would erupt in Europe. So, keeping the Arab nations on Britain's side was becoming crucially important. As Neville Chamberlain said, "If we must defend one side, let us defend the Jews rather than the Arabs." So peace talks began at the London Conference, and they published the White Paper. This rejected partition and limited Jewish migration. They even agreed Palestine would be given independence in 10 years. Many of the more moderate Arabs accepted these conditions, but a lot of Zionists were angered by the agreement, especially when there was a risk of further persecution in Germany. As MP James Rothschild said, "For the majority of the Jews who go to Palestine, it is a question of migration or of physical extinction." So the revisionist Zionists began to strike British buildings and Arab citizens once again. Jabotinsky even planned on starting a huge rebellion against the British, but when this didn't come, Avraham Stern formed his own unit, known as Lehi. They planned on training Jews in Poland with the help of the Polish government and sending them over to Palestine to forcibly take the country. But the outbreak of World War II ended this plan. Throughout all of this rebellion, much of the world watched on, and the rebels did have many supporters. But in Jordan, Abdullah had his own plans. He actually accepted the Peel Commission to partition the country, as the small Palestinian state would then be placed in a union with the king. People obviously protested against his leadership, and in Ajloun, Rashid al-Khuzai led supporters in open rebellion. It didn't last particularly long, as his position was bombed and he fled the country. Yet Abdullah would continue to be a very controversial ruler in the Arab world. Elsewhere, many Arab leaders met at the Bludan Conference in 1937. This was almost the first ever pan-Arab conference, with representatives from across the region condemning partition. But true material support for the Palestinians could well have come from Hitler and Mussolini. Now, this next bit is pretty controversial, but we know that Husseini, back in 1933, wrote to the German consul in Jerusalem and congratulated Hitler on his success. He wrote, "Muslims inside and outside Palestine welcome the new regime in Germany and hope for the spread of fascist, anti-democratic state leadership to other countries." He went on to say that Jewish influence was damaging everywhere and needed to be fought. Husseini's Palestinian Arab Party also established a youth corps modelled on the Hitler Youth, and from very early on, the British found Nazi weapons and money inside Palestine. Then, although the Germans were initially forcibly deporting Jews from Europe, in 1937 the German consul said a Jewish Palestinian state would create additional national power bases for international Jewry, such as, for example, the Vatican State for political Catholicism or Moscow for the communists. Mussolini, on the other hand, was both pro-Arab and pro-Jewish. It seems that he was looking for any ally in the region to counter British influence. As I mentioned before, he supported revisionist Zionists, but he also came up with a new plan that he thought could appease everyone, and that was to settle the Jews in Ethiopia. There, they would live near the Ethiopian Jews who had lived there for centuries, and the increased migration would lead to further development in Italian East Africa. But I must say though that many Arabs did outright deny Nazism, even those who saw them as potential liberators, like Shakib Arslan in Lebanon. He, for instance, said, "I do not care for Hitler, nor do I defend him or believe his ideology," and he came to see the Italians and Germans as just new colonists. However, there were genuine fascists. Like in Syria, Antun Sada created the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. He argued that Syria should expand into Lebanon, parts of Turkey and Iraq, but reject any ideas of pan-Arabism, arguing that Syria was a distinct race and a superior one. He, however, denied that he was inspired by European fascism, and his ideas that Syrians were somehow a superior group was not really a racial concept. As a Christian himself, he looked to unite all sorts of groups, and said of race, "Every nation comprises diverse racial groups, and none is the product of one race or one specific tribe." So his view of Syrians included historically the Phoenicians, Babylonians and more, and geography to him mattered a great deal more. Otherwise, in Iraq there was the Al-Matana Club, under the guidance of Fritz Grober. Some of their members, like Yunus al-Sabawi, translated Mein Kampf, and later held important positions in government. In his case, he was the Minister of Economics. On the other side of the political spectrum, the Palestinian Communist Party was still predominantly Jewish, but they did have some Arab members, like Mohammad Najati Sidki. He attended many of the communist internationals, like in 1936 in Moscow. There he met Khalid Bakdash of the Syrian Communist Party. But the two men argued because Bakdash refused to endorse the use of nationalism to advance a largely internationalist ideology. Sidki was then sent to Tashkent to see firsthand how the Soviet Union was able to stamp out nationalism among the Central Asians. Sidki, though, is an interesting character, and his actions bring up another event that divided the Islamic world somewhat: the Spanish Civil War. When Franco rebelled against the Spanish Republic, he was in Spanish Morocco, and brought tens of thousands of Moroccan volunteers with him to fight on the mainland. He then promoted the unity of Christians, Muslims and Jews in a holy war against non-believers. As Franco himself said, "Our war is a religious war. We who fight, whether Christians or Muslims, are soldiers of God, and we are not fighting against men, but against atheism and materialism." He also received the backing of Moulay el-Mahdi, who held the title bestowed to him by the Spanish, the Caliph of Tetuan. Franco even sponsored Muslims to go on the Hajj, and went on to promote the religious ties between Christians and Muslims through a romanticized look at medieval Muslim Spain or Al-Andalus. So thousands continue to fight for Franco, and this is when Sidki arrived, offering to raise an army to fight against Franco. But only a handful of people ever joined him, and even Arab papers like the Philistine supported Franco over communism. Many Spanish communists were also reluctant to have any help from Moroccans. Dolores Ibarruchi called them hordes of Moors, beastly savages drunk with sensuality who rape our women and daughters. Though it should be said, that Moroccans across Europe were often portrayed this way. Like in Germany immediately after the First World War, the French had occupied the Rhineland, and many of their troops came from the colonies. Their often exaggerated and usually discredited stories began to appear in the press, of wild Moroccans, Senegalese and more, assaulting countless women. This was known as the Black Horror of the Rhine, and it became international news, and a focus of the early Nazi Party, who sterilized many mixed-race children, known as the Rhineland Bastards. But sticking on Morocco, by the 1930s, some like Elal al-Farsi and Ahmad Belefrej were demanding their full independence. They founded groups like the Moroccan Action Committee, but the French just quickly exiled them. While over in Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba also began his rise. He joined the Nationalist Destor Party, led by Abdelaziz Talbi. He joined in protests against the French for holding Christian services in Carthage in 1930. Then when the French held celebrations for the 50th anniversary of the Protectorate, he published scathing articles in his paper, calling it a humiliation. But in 1932, the Tunisians were then split over the French granting them citizenship. Although this may sound good in theory, the nationalists argued that this was a ploy to wipe out Tunisian culture. He also began to grow impatient with the methods of the older members of the party, so Habib broke away and founded the Neo-Destor Party. The French though quickly arrested him and the other leaders, setting off protests across the country. This lasted for a couple of years until 1936, when Armand Guillon was brought in. To try and make peace, he released Habib from prison and sent him for talks in Paris with the new socialist government of France under Léon Blum. Guillon, by the way, was himself a socialist, and he tried to alleviate some of the economic burdens for the Tunisians, who were suffering from droughts and the larger depression. To do this, he introduced many socialist laws like the 8-hour workday, but again, the construction of schools raised more problems, as French was prioritized as a language. So still strikes continued, and Léon Blum's government would collapse in France. Realizing that no deals could be made in Paris, Habib returned and held a congress in 1937, focusing the party on a more revolutionary path. This policy gained even more support when, on the 9th of April 1938, the French fired at protesters, killing around 22 of them. This, you could say, marked the beginning of the Tunisian independence movement, and Tunisians still honor the day on Martyrs' Day. Habib though was arrested very quickly afterwards, but the French could not really quell the nationalist movements in North Africa now, like in neighbouring Algeria, where there was a new problem. Here it should be said that the Germans at this time were not the only people exporting anti-Semitism. As the French prefect of Oran argued, the Algerian Jews are not French, their customs are Oriental, strangers to the traditions of the French nation. Oran was also the base of a new fascist party known as the Latin Union. They argued that the settlers in Algeria, whether they were French, Spanish or Italians, were a superior race. Some speculate that they tried to instigate violence between the Muslims and the Jews. However, there's no real evidence of this. Regardless, in Constantine in 1934, there was some sort of confrontation between a Jewish man and some Muslims, although what exactly happened is still disputed. But in the end, 25 Jews and 3 Muslims were killed. One report describes a scene of utter desolation and horror, of Jewish girls with their breasts cut off, of little children with numerous knife wounds, and of whole families locked in their homes and burnt to death. And this rise of anti-Semitic attacks would continue across the region over the following decade or so. Although back at the beginning of the 20th century, Jews made up 20% of cities like Algiers, today there's only around 100 or so left in the entire country. Elsewhere, the rising fascist powers could have found allies in the Arabian Peninsula. Mussolini, for instance, continued trying to woo over Yemen, while Ibn Saud was moving further away from Britain. Yemen and Saudi Arabia, though, clashed a couple times, starting in 1931, when the Yemenis captured Narjan. Ibn Saud reacted and kicked them out the following year, pushing his domain south. But very little else is known about the conflict. There was a larger conflict in 1934 over the Emirate of Asir. The emir here had accepted Saudi authority, but the treaty was an uneasy one, and the Yemenis still claimed the territory. Reportedly, when the Saudis sent delegates to meet Yahya of Yemen, he said, "Who is this Bedouin coming to challenge my family's 900-year rule?" In 1934, Yahya finally made peace with Britain and had his rule recognized, allowing him to focus on claiming territories to the north. It was said he eradicated all those who opposed him in the border towns, prompting Ibn Saud to declare war in March. Once again, they took back Narjan and Hajara and quickly moved into Yemen itself. By May, they attacked Hodeidah and looked to move on to the capital of Sana'a. Yahya finally had to surrender, giving up claims on all Saudi lands. But the Great Depression had actually hit Saudi Arabia pretty hard. For instance, the number of pilgrims to Mecca and Medina halved. So they began to get a little more serious about searching for oil, as many of their neighbours had already done so. In nearby Bahrain, the Sheikh had signed concessions back in the 1920s, and in 1932, oil was struck. 400 barrels an hour were produced, and some of the first exports were shipped off to Japan. Or Qatar also struck oil in 1937 around Dukhan, convincing Ibn Saud to follow suit, granting concessions to foreign companies, including American ones. In 1938, they too struck oil at Dammam, and they could now produce up to 1,600 barrels a day. This began a long history of Saudi-American ties, and this relationship may well have kept the Saudis neutral during the war. After all, Saudi Arabia was a refuge for many Arab rebels and the occasional Nazi like Grober. In 1939, Saudi emissaries also met with Hitler, but they were still a pretty impoverished nation, with an army that fought on camels. So, for now, the ruler depended on subsidies from Western nations. Yet I should also say that the Japanese sent delegates to meet with the Saudis. Although nothing really came of it, one of their visits was notable as they witnessed an assassination attempt on the king. The assassins, though, were killed before further information could be gained, so what their motives were is not known. And this finally brings us to 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began. When World War II began, the Islamic world became a battleground of propaganda campaigns. Hitler himself, much like Kaiser Wilhelm beforehand, was actually very keen on Islam, and believed there were some Aryans in the region. For instance, he said, "Here and there one meets amongst the Arabs, men with fair hair and blue eyes. They're the descendants of the Vandals who occupied North Africa." He also believed that Islam brought culture and science to Spain, and claimed had the Franks not stopped their advances, we should, in all probability, have been converted to Mohammedanism, that cult which glorifies heroism and which opens the seventh heaven to the bold warrior alone. Then the Germanic races would have conquered the world. Christianity alone prevented them from doing so. Himmler also tried to find passages to provide Muslims with the basis for the opinion that the Führer has already been forecast in the Quran. Ernst Kattelbrunner couldn't find such a passage, so just settled on pushing forward the narrative that the returned Isa defeats the giant and Jew king Dajjal at the end of the world. Even Hitler said, "I'm going to become a religious figure. Soon I'll be the great chief of the Tartars. Already Arabs and Moroccans are mingling my name with their prayers." So when war was declared, the Nazis began working to forge alliances within the Islamic world. And when the Italians joined in the war, there was real fighting along the borders of Libya and Egypt, splitting the allegiances of Muslims in North Africa. For instance, Idris of the Senussi order promised to support the British, in the hopes that they would chase the Italians out of his country, and he even managed to raise a small force of locals to aid the Allies. While across the border, many Egyptians were trying to rally together groups to support the Italians. One notable collaborator was Anwar Sadat, the future leader of the country. He tried to unite the various groups and use this opportunity to push the British out. He was joined by other members of the Young Egypt Party, like al-Msiri. He had worked with the British during the Arab Revolt, and at this point was on the Regency Council. Yet in 1940, he would be dismissed when the British found documents in his house proving that he had contacts with the Italians in Libya. But many in Egypt feared fascism more than the British. For instance, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was said to have received a great deal of funding from the Nazis, but he publicised writings criticising fascism. Yet then, in Europe, Germany would quickly seize France and set up the Vichy government. With that, Lebanon, Syria, Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria were brought under the rule of this new puppet state. Now the British position in the Middle East was left incredibly weakened. They were fighting the Italians off in Egypt, they had few friends in Palestine, and the Germans and Italians were using Vichy Syria to bomb their positions. Then it was about to get even weaker in 1941 when the Iraqis almost joined the Axis. Here, Sidki had come to power in a coup a few years earlier, but was assassinated. Al-Midfai took over the country afterwards, but, like with his predecessors, often ruled as a military dictator. In fact, the British had quite a large role in creating this problem, as they invested heavily in the army, while leaving other institutions weakened. So nearly every prime minister depended on one of the major generals in the country in order to secure their power. Midfai did have his opponents though. Nouri al-Said, for instance, was another former prime minister who had fled to Britain to escape persecution. He therefore remained pro-British and was able to convince a prominent general, Salah al-Din al-Sabag, to launch a coup in December 1938. But al-Sabag was a strange ally, as he had spent time training in Germany and was one of the generals that formed the Golden Square, which favoured an alliance with Germany. The following year, King Ghazi died in a car crash, and many held Nouri as responsible. Plus, the new monarch, Faisal II, was just a child, so a regent was appointed. This was Abd al-Ilah, and he largely followed Nouri's pro-British policies. However, conflicts outside of Iraq would begin to cause troubles for Nouri. Notably, rebel Palestinians fled to Iraq, including Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He then met with Iraqi Arab nationalists, further stoking the flames of rebellion. Al-Sabag then withdrew his support from Nouri, forcing him to resign. He was succeeded by al-Gaylani, who had been prime minister before, and was opposed to any concessions to the British. He also then refused to break off ties with Italy, and even sent diplomats to meet with the Germans. An Iraqi shift towards the Axis would be disastrous for the British, as Iraqi oil would fuel the German war effort. So the British responded quickly and placed sanctions on the country. Meanwhile, over in Egypt at Tobruk, the British were able to hold off the Italian advances in 1941, securing their position in the Middle East for now. This allowed the Iraqi regent to pressure Gaylani to step down in early 1941. Yet, the members of the Golden Square made plans to reinstall him into power. The regent then discovered these plans and fled, allowing the coup leaders to march into Baghdad on April the 1st and reinstall Gaylani. He quickly refused to allow British troops to pass through his country, which was essential to the fronts in Egypt and also in Greece. So the Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, sent troops to Basra to challenge this decision. Gaylani, however, refused to budge, so British troops landed in the Habaniya airbase as well. The Iraqi army quickly surrounded the airbase, believing that this would push the British into seeking a diplomatic resolution. But the British just bombarded their positions. At the same time, Hitler issued Order No. 30, declaring, "The Arab freedom movement in the Middle East is our natural ally against England. I have therefore decided to move forward in the Middle East by supporting Iraq." So the Axis powers began shipping in weapons via Syria, and the British sent in another force from Transjordan. This Arab Legion relieved the airbase, and together they marched on, despite Luftwaffe bombardment. They took over Fallujah after heavy street fighting, and the force in Basra was reinforced and they too began to advance. They all marched on Baghdad with initially a small force of only 2,000 men. Fortunately for the British, however, Iraqi intelligence was poor and Gaylani panicked, believing a much larger force was about to enter the capital. He therefore fled to Persia on the 29th of May and left behind a power vacuum in the city. With no government in the city, people began to riot, and over the next 2 days, they began to attack the Jewish people. Jews, by the way, had lived in Iraq for centuries, and made up a considerable chunk of the population of the capital. Yet, it seems that the Zionist issue, along with Nazi propaganda, began to change everything. Anti-Semitic propaganda was broadcast by Radio Berlin in Arabic, while there were some notable fascists in high-ranking positions. For instance, there was Yunus al-Sabawi, who was a member of the ministry. He had actually temporarily declared himself to be the governor of the capital, and planned on calling for much larger massacres. These riots, known as the Farhud, saw 200 people killed and considerable damage in Jewish areas. However, there are also numerous instances of Muslims defending Jews from the crowds, sometimes at the cost of their own life. The British then entered Baghdad and brought back the regent and Prime Minister al-Midfai. Order was then restored violently, while many of the culprits, including al-Sabawi, were executed. And although this didn't mark the end of the Jewish community in Iraq, it wouldn't be long before most of them had left. British troops would remain in Iraq throughout the remainder of the war in order to secure their oil, and this marked a turning point in the entire conflict, as now the Axis advance in the region had been halted. Iraq would then be used as a base to launch an invasion of Syria and Iran. So let's start with Syria. This was under the control of Vichy France and was being supplied with Axis weapons. The British, worried that they could soon strike at the Suez Canal, decided to act quickly. The Vichy forces were under the control of Henri Dance and numbered around 45,000 men, while within Syria, the local population were overwhelmingly in favour of the Axis powers. For instance, in 1940, when France was defeated, allegedly crowds in Damascus chanted, "No more Monsieur, no more Mister, Allah's in heaven and Hitler's on earth." Or, like Sami al-Jundi said, "We were racialists, admiring Nazism. Whoever has lived during this period in Damascus will appreciate the inclination of the Arab people to Nazism." And he, by the way, was a follower of yet another new movement in the region. This began around 1940, when Michael Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Battar founded the Arab Aya movement. They merged with another group founded by Zaki al-Arzuzi to create the Ba'athist Party. This group called for an Arab resurrection and, importantly, was a cross-religious group, as Aflaq himself was a Christian. Their ties to the Nazis, though, have been disputed. Aflaq was previously linked to the Communist Party in France, but he also seemingly read a lot of Nazi literature, like many of the early members. Take for instance al-Jundi, who said, "We were the first to think of translating Mein Kampf." He also wanted the tiger as a symbol to excite the imagination of the youth in the tradition of Nazism and fascism, but taking into consideration the fact that the Arab is, in his nature, distant from pagan symbols like the swastika. But then he also argued that Arabs and Jews should come together to an understanding in this world and cooperate in order to re-establish the Arabs' glory and realize the Semitic genius, which is the Judeo-Arab genius. So their messaging was pretty confused. But even the more accepted national bloc emulated the fascists in having their supporters wear iron shirts, much like the Wafd party in Egypt wore blue shirts. One future Ba'athist politician named Akram al-Hurani mocked these men, saying that they were far from a true combat unit. It did, however, take a great interest in the organization's external appearances, its uniforms and insignia for instance, which were in the fashionable Nazi and fascist style that appealed to people in those days. So, emulating the fascists wasn't unique to the Ba'athist Party. However, as I'll get onto later, they may well have provided sanctuary to many Nazi members after the war. But all of this wouldn't mean much anyway, as within a month, the Allies invaded Syria and the Free French government took control. Once there, de Gaulle proclaimed that the French would recognise Syrian independence once again, but their troops would remain in the country for the remainder of the war. Yet the Axis still had allies in the region. The deposed Iraqi leader Gaylani had eventually fled to Germany and worked alongside the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini. To many, though, it was believed that the Grand Mufti had the real power. The Germans, on the other hand, had already been active in Palestine. Like in 1941, the Sentinel reported, "Nazi-run guns to the Arabs in Palestine." In addition, Nazi warplanes taking off from Iraq dropped leaflets inciting the Arabs for a holy war against the British and the Jews. And the following year, American intelligence discovered the majority of the Palestinian Arabs was fiercely anti-Jewish and saw in the approach of Rommel an ideal opportunity to murder all Jews, then seize their property. Yet, even within the Zionist camp, some had made contact with the Nazis. Now, I should say that the Zionists were split between the socialists, the centrists, and the revisionists, the latter having fought against the British prior to the war. The leader of the revisionists was Jabotinsky, and he had agreed to stop fighting the British while the war was ongoing, but he had died in 1940. The British, on the other hand, continued to make themselves unpopular among the Zionists by limiting Jewish migration to Palestine with the White Paper. Then the Royal Navy even sent some would-be Jewish refugees back to Europe early on. But Ben-Gurion called for Jews to support the British as if there is no White Paper, and oppose the White Paper as if there is no war. Thousands, therefore, did join in the fight on Britain's side, including one of the founders of the revisionist Irgun paramilitary known as David Ratziel. But others were not so keen, like Avraham Stern. He led a breakaway group known as Lehigh, determined to fight against the British. At one point, they even planned on training up Jews in Poland and invading Palestine by force. But the Nazi invasion of Poland stopped these plans. He continued to believe that there should be no negotiation with the British or Arabs, and recruited many men into his ranks that would later become leaders of Israel, like Yitzhak Shamir, while the other revisionist paramilitary group, the Irgun, was led by another future leader of Israel, Menachem Begin. All of these the British at the time described as terrorists. Stern therefore continued attacking the odd British policeman, and in 1941 he sent a letter to the Nazis promising to actively take part in the war on Germany's side in exchange for their support of a Jewish homeland. Now, obviously this will sound ridiculous to many, but Stern, like other revisionists, had begun to follow some elements of fascism. Lehi publications, for instance, often spoke of Jews being a superior race and the Arabs were a slave race that should be expelled from the lands. For all of this, he and the revisionists became the target of British police and the more moderate Zionists. In 1942, the British police managed to kill Stern himself and chase most of the other revisionists underground for now. Meanwhile, as for the Mufti, Himmler in particular wanted to use his religious standing to encourage more Muslims to fight for the Axis powers, initially in the Balkans. There, the Germans had created a puppet state in Croatia, but Himmler wanted to utilize the Muslims in Bosnia and even in Albania. The Mufti was also seemingly aware of the Holocaust by 1943, and said Germany has very clearly recognized the Jews for what they are, and resolved to find a definitive solution for the Jewish danger. In one radio broadcast in 1944, he also urged Arabs to kill Jews wherever you find them, for the love of God, history and religion. In exchange for this support, back in 1940, he demanded recognition and Axis support for a free Arab state, and of course, an end to Jewish settlements. He even requested Mussolini recognize his sovereignty of an Arab state, including Iraq, Syria, Palestine and Transjordan, and in return, he would later discuss the holy places Lebanon, the Suez Canal and Aqaba. Other Palestinian nationalists like Khalil Sakakini supported the Axis powers, and so too did allegedly over 88% of the Arabs in the region, when asked in an opinion poll at the time. But it should be said that many Arabs in Palestine condemned the Nazis as well. Like the Philistine newspaper reported back in 1934, Nazism is an ideology full of disrespect of all peoples. It glorifies the German, and therein lies a danger. And the Al-Ghad paper said, they stand at the side of those who fight fascism. We are not stupid enough to believe the sentence, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yet, many of the Arabs who volunteered for the British side would defect to join the Axis Arab Legion. This term, the Arab Legion, was used to describe a number of units, like Sonderverband 287, which was mainly made up of Iraqis, Syrians and other prisoners of war. So there was still hope of finding allies in the Middle East, and by 1942, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was underway. It was then that Ribbentrop produced a memorandum called Germany's Advance Towards the Arab World, which laid out their plans. They envisioned that when they moved into the Caucasus and occupied Tbilisi, the exiled leaders would meet and call upon the people to rise up against the Allies. They then march south to Basra and link up with the Japanese. Once this is done, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen and Egypt would remain independent states, and Syria, Lebanon, Palestine and Transjordan would be united into a greater Syrian state. Although Ribbentrop agreed that Italy has political primacy in Egypt. Otherwise, Iraq would then annex Kuwait, while Saudi Arabia would take Oman and the rest of the British colonies in Arabia. Mussolini, though, continued to be split over what to do with the Muslims. On the one hand, he claimed to be the defender of the Muslims, but on the other, he warned Hitler of these plans, saying, I hope we do not live to regret promises you have made to Arab leaders. You do not know them like we do. He then went on to say that the Italians had been betrayed by them in Libya. So to avoid what Ernst Vollmann called the Arab game, other Nazis like Hans Bohler advocated for a total Arab federation, obviously under German influence. Yet as always, other plans were on the table. Hitler still wanted to keep the Vichy French on his side, so giving away Syria and Lebanon would of course go against this. And Hitler said that he would not issue any proclamations on the subject until our troops were in Mosul. The Italian policy in the Middle East also continued to anger Hitler throughout the war, as it presented the Axis as just new colonial oppressors. So, as Hitler said, the Duce's claim to be regarded as the sword of Islam arouses just as much laughter today as it did before the war. Hitler also felt like he missed out on what he called a grand policy toward Islam because of our loyalty to the Italian ally. As for other possible allies in the region, there was Ibn Saud. Even before the war, the Germans had been sending weapons to the Saudis, and in 1938, a foreign policy memo said, Germany's policy in the Near East could be effectively supported through Saudi Arabia, the centre of the Mohammedan world. Hitler also received a Saudi envoy, Khalid al-Hud, and declared that they were both fighting the same enemies. The Nazis even compared their current conflict to that of Muhammad when he drove the Jews from Arabia. In 1940, Franz von Papen even suggested that the Mufti and Saudis enter into an alliance and divide up the territories belonging to the British and King Abdullah. A year later, in 1941, the Germans requested Ibn Saud's help in supporting the coup in Iraq. In return, he would be recognised as the king of all the Arabs. But Ibn Saud refused and withdrew his ambassadors. Then there was also Turkey. Here, Hitler, like elsewhere, was deeming anyone he liked as Aryan. We've lost some of our Germanics, the Berbers of North Africa, the Kurds of Asia Minor. One of them was Kemal Ataturk, who had nothing to do with his compatriots from the racial point of view. But elsewhere, he seems to have been particularly fond of Turkic people. Like in the Caucasus, he said he didn't trust creating Georgian units, as the only ones I consider to be reliable are the pure Muslims, which means the real Turkish nations. And as a proclaimed follower of the Young Turks and later Ataturk, Hitler justified some of his own actions saying, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Geopolitically, though, an alliance with Turkey would secure Germany's borders. As Hitler said himself, the Finns cover one of our flanks, Turkey covers the other. That's an ideal solution for me. But the Allies were also trying to win over Turkey, promising them parts of Syria, the Greek islands, and Bulgaria. But the Germans went further and appealed to those Turks who supported pan-Turkism or pan-Turanism. The Germans allowed these groups to work within the Caucasus, hoping to start a Turkic rebellion in Azerbaijan and maybe further afield in Central Asia, connecting with the Basmachi rebels. Bey Mirza Hayit, for instance, served in the Turkestan Legion and would later write a series of books advocating for uniting Turkic states, including East Turkestan in China. There were, by the way, some Nazi agents, engineers and missionaries working in East Turkestan in the 30s, like George Vassel, but he was arrested by the Soviets. Hitler, however, was unwilling to make concrete promises until Turkey joined the Axis. And once again, it was his alliance with the Italians that hindered his plans. Like even before the war, Sarikoglu suggested an Anglo-Soviet Turkish defensive alliance. But when Stalin and Hitler made a pact, Inonu realised any Turkish involvement would quickly result in disaster. Yet the Germans kept on trying to pull the Turks onto their side, and one way they did this was by publishing information regarding Operation Pike. This was an Allied plan to bomb Azeri oil fields early on in the war in order to stop the Soviets from fueling the Nazi war effort. Well, the Turks were made aware of this plan, and the Germans revealed this information to the Soviets in order to worsen their relations. The Axis powers then moved south and either took over most of the Balkan nations or aligned with them. So Sarikoglu was sent to sign a treaty of non-aggression with the Nazis, and the Turks began exporting chromite to them. But the nation still remained neutral. This, however, was not a particularly popular choice, as inside Turkey, a growing number of far-right nationalists were advocating for war. Nihal Atsiz, for instance, rejected Ataturk's idea that the Turkish people were somehow connected with the Anatolian civilizations like the Hittites. Instead, he wanted to almost resurrect a pre-Islamic Turkic culture and unite the various Turkic people around the world, all the while pushing some degree of racial purity. The government did go along with some of his rhetoric, as in 1939, Prime Minister Refik Saydam said he would not accept masses of Jews, nor individual Jews who were oppressed in other countries. And in 1942, the Jewish community, like the Christians in Turkey, were hit by the wealth tax. This tax was supposed to raise funds for national defense, but in reality, it struck at the ethnic minorities who still controlled many of the industries in the country. As Sarikoglu said in a speech, "We have a chance to gain our economic independence. We will abolish all foreigners from our economy and hand it over to the Turkish citizens." The amount of tax each person paid was determined arbitrarily, based on lifestyle and a community average. Sometimes they even forced non-Muslims to pay twice more than they actually earned, while Muslims, on the other hand, only paid around 5%. Many therefore sold everything they had, and if they couldn't pay, they were sent off to labour camps. This was the fate for over 5,000 people, all of whom were non-Muslims, while the state confiscated around $4 billion of assets in today's money. There were also issues the Turkic government perceived with certain Muslim groups. Obviously the Kurds continued to push for autonomy, but then there were the Circassians. Like the deputy of Eskişehir said, in the past they were preoccupied with selling girls to the palace, now smuggling. Why are we tolerating these nomads who have been horse thieves? The Allies would eventually step in and pressure Turkey to stop confiscating lands, but it had forced many Jews to move to Palestine. To make matters worse, in 1942, they refused to repatriate many Turkish Jews during the war, though it should be said some individual Turks like Selahattin Ulukumen stepped in to save many. Going back to the Nazis though, as they possibly had another ally in Reza Shah of Iran. The Germans had already been investing heavily in the country, the Iranians were trapped between Germany's rivals, and a German victory could see the Shah potentially take back his lands. As Hitler himself said, if there is anyone who was praying for the success of our armies, it must be the Shah of Persia. Then in Afghanistan, King Zahir Shah as well allowed the Germans to invest in his country, and he also made requests to annex British land in India should the Germans win in 1941. As he said, justice for Afghanistan would be created only when the country's frontier had been extended to the Indus. So a greater Afghanistan, obviously under German influence, could well have been created. But in the region the Germans had another possible ally, the Fakir of Ipi. He had long evaded the British, earning the nickname the Scarlet Pimpernel of Waziristan. Well, in 1940, Dr. Manfred Oberdorfer and Fred Brandt were sent to Afghanistan and modern-day Pakistan to try and find him. They may well have supported his plans for creating an independent country for the Pashtuns. However, in 1941, Oberdorov was killed and Brandt was arrested after a firefight with Afghan troops. At first though, these nations weren't particularly on the forefront of the war, but just 1 month after the British took control of Iraq, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa. The British and the Soviets demanded that the Shah break off diplomatic relations with Germany, as they realised that if Iran was to join the Axis, they would cut off the Allies' shipment of arms to the Soviet Union. Plus, they would also open up fronts in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and possibly challenge British India and their control over the Middle East. The Shah, however, refused, so the British and the Soviets coordinated a joint invasion of his country in August 1941. The Royal Navy attacked Iranian ships, and 200,000 Allied troops moved in. The Shah had maybe around 125,000 troops. Yet, despite his modernization efforts, he was still some years off having a completely modern army. The British took the oil fields of Khuzestan and moved on to Kermanshah. At the same time, the Soviets captured important towns like Tabriz and Mashhad, and then the armies merged in central Iran and bombed the capital. At this point, the Shah panicked. He beat generals who tried to make peace with the Allies and forced his own prime minister to resign, accusing him of demoralizing the army. He then appointed Muhammad Ali Foroughi as the new prime minister. Yet he was an old enemy of the Shah, and he quickly worked against him. He met with the Allies and argued that the people wanted to be liberated from the Shah's rule. So the British and the Soviets agreed to halt their advance if the Shah agreed to hand over all German nationals and cut off diplomatic relations with all Axis powers. But because the Red Army would certainly kill the German nationals, the Shah and Foroughi delayed, giving the Germans time to flee. This angered the Soviets, who began to advance once again in September, and when they entered the capital, they forced thousands to flee, including the Shah. His son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became the new Shah, and he seemed like a good fit for the British, as he spoke English fluently and seemed somewhat pro-Western. But he was forced to rule over an occupied country for the remainder of the war. Elsewhere though, the Axis powers tried to advance again. For instance, Rommel made his way into North Africa and tried to invade Egypt. There, King Farouk continued to rule over a divided nation, and no prime minister ruled for very long. In this period, they had Ali Mahir Pasha from the Islamist Ittihad Party, Mustafa el-Nahas from the nationalist Wafd Party, and independents like Hassan Sabri Pasha and Hussein Siri Pasha. Also, the British High Commissioner Miles Lampson despised Farouk and constantly advised him to appoint pro-British prime ministers like Hassan Sabri Pasha. However, Sabri died in 1940, and Hussein Siri Pasha came to power next, once again at the insistence of Lampson. He had no real support in the country though, and he also agreed to host the Greek government in exile and broke off relations with Vichy France, all without consulting Farouk. So yet another political crisis ensued, with Siri being forced into resigning. Lampson though needed stability in Egypt as the Axis were advancing into the western borders once again, so he demanded that the king bring Nahas and the Wafd Party into government. He then sent an ultimatum to Farouk saying, "Unless I hear by 6 PM today that Nahas has been asked to form a government, His Majesty King Farouk must accept the consequences." Farouk though refused, so Lampson moved and surrounded Abdeen Palace in February 1942. The king was then forced to appoint Nahas as prime minister, and in return he was allowed to keep his throne. Many army officers, like the future leader Nasser, saw this whole thing as a national humiliation. As he said, "I am ashamed of our army's powerlessness." And despite spending lavishly on his palaces, womanizing, drinking, and strangely constantly stealing, this whole event made Farouk more popular in the eyes of the Egyptians. Plus, just as a side note, he was the first king from Muhammad Ali's dynasty that could ever deliver a speech in Arabic. But on the other hand, he also welcomed exiled Balkan rulers into Egypt, like Peter II of Yugoslavia, George II of Greece, and Zog of Albania, seemingly wanting to re-establish his family's ties with the Balkans. Plus, after the war, a whole dossier was produced detailing Farouk's discussions with the Nazis going back to 1941. He also congratulated the coup leaders in Iraq and warned the Iranians of British and Soviet plans to invade. Farouk also offered his best wishes to the Mufti of Jerusalem and to all those who work with him for the success and victory of the Axis. There were other supposed plans, like the king fleeing to Axis countries, or even bombing Jewish lands in Palestine. But on the field, the British halted yet another Axis assault at El Alamein in 1942, securing the country. Had they lost though, it's safe to assume that Farouk would probably join the Axis. Yet it should be said though that many Egyptians disagreed with Nazism, like Taha Hussein, a famous author. As he described the people in Nazi Germany, "They live like a society of insects. They must behave like ants in an anthill or like bees in a hive." And of course there were a great deal more. Going back to the Mufti though, after failing to stir up rebellions in the Caucasus, he recentered his focus on Tunisia, and in his words, wanted to set up a band of Arabs as a fighting force and equip them. They will march to Egypt and other Arab countries. However, almost as soon as he relocated, the Allies opened up another front in French North Africa through Operation Torch, and it is here that we probably find the greatest resistance to fascism in the Islamic world. Under Vichy control, the decree granting citizenship to Algerian Jews was revoked, and a network of labour camps were established all the way from Morocco over to Tunisia. A group of Nazis under Walter Rauff was sent to Africa to wipe out the Jewish populations, using, among other things, mobile gas vans. And it was a sizable population, with Tunisia alone having around 105,000 Jewish people. Most Arabs in North Africa though apparently responded to the new laws, with what Jacques Sabile describes as glacial indifference. But there were numerous people who stood up against the laws. Many Islamic scholars in Algeria, like Sheikh Tayyib El-Okbi, argued, "The Quran says that humans are born brothers, and that Islam does not make a difference between races. True Muslims do not belittle other races." There are also many examples of Algerians providing refuge to Jews, while Algerian nationalist Messali Haj said, "Lowering the rights of Jews did not increase the rights of Muslims." Or Farhud Abbas said, "Your French racism runs in all directions. Today against the Jews, and always against the Arabs." Keep his name in mind for later on. In Tunisia, Ahmed Pasha Bey and his successor Monsef Bey were forced into following the anti-Semitic laws. But again, they did their best to stop mass repression. seeing Muslims and Jews as their subjects. Moncef Bey even warned his officials, "If I find out that an Arab informer caused even one hair of a Jew to fall, this Arab will pay with his life." As such, he has been dubbed the protector of the Jews. While prominent nationalist Habib Bourguiba was in prison, he refused to get involved, believing that the Germans had no chance of victory. So, as he wrote, "The order is given to you and to the activists to make contact with Gaullist French to combine our clandestine action. Our support must be unconditional. It is a matter of life and death for Tunisia." However, when France fell, he was moved to Italy, where it was hoped he would become a possible figurehead. He was then forced to broadcast messages to the Tunisian people, but never actively collaborated to any notable degree. Then there was Morocco, where King Mohammed V refused to send Jews into ghettos or force them to wear yellow stars. He declared, "The Israelites will remain under my protection. I refuse to make any distinction between my subjects." As well as protecting the Jews in their homelands, up to 250,000 North Africans enlisted to fight for the Allies. And it should be said, 450 Arabs, mainly Algerians, have been confirmed to have been killed in the death camps of Europe. Compare all this, by the way, to the 40,000 Jews who lived in Italian Libya. Many were sent to labour camps where they would either be killed or die in harsh conditions. Like 3,000 were sent to the Sidi Azaz labour camp, where they slept in tents in the desert, or the Giaudo concentration camp, where hundreds died of malnutrition. Then the situation was made worse when German troops took control of the war effort in North Africa. Many Libyan Jews were sent back to Europe to be killed in death camps. Then the Jewish communities here would suffer for many more years, as violence and pogroms continued. There were, however, some in North Africa that were opposed to the Allies, especially the French, like Alal al-Farsi and Ahmad Balefrej, who were living in exile. Balefrej even met with the Germans to discuss the possibility of supporting the Axis. However, as he said to his fellow nationalists, "Do not let yourself take part in the German siren call," obviously seeing the duplicity of their promises. The Vichy government, meanwhile, did have the support of some locals, like the Moroccan Gormiers, but they had also previously fought alongside the Allies at the start of the war, and would quickly switch sides once again. So when the British and Americans planned on landing in North Africa, they had many allies among the local population, and even within the Vichy army. These allies would then take power in the cities before any landing took place. Like in Algiers, a group of Vichy officers, including many Jews, like José Albuquerque, formed the Geogras group. They seized key buildings on November 8th, and then the Allies moved in, facing limited opposition. Sometimes this failed though, like in Casablanca, where the Vichy general was able to stop the coup and call in reinforcements. But the Allies still landed successfully. François Darlan, the Vichy commander in North Africa, had already been captured in Algiers, while his men continued to offer some resistance. So the Allies decided to change plans and shock everybody. Before the invasion, they planned on giving command over General Henri Giraud, but many of the French in North Africa rejected his command. Instead, they gave Darlan power in a deal, if he ordered his men to lay down their arms. Within next to no time then, the Allies advanced onto Tunisia, where the Axis dug in and held out until spring 1943. In the meantime, though, the complicated Darlan affair was resolved when a 20-year-old assassin, Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle, just killed him. He was supposed to have been a monarchist, determined to bring the Orleans dynasty back to power, but others believe the British, or possibly de Gaulle, were behind the assassination. Giraud therefore took control of the French troops, but he made enemies out of nearly everyone. For instance, he arrested many of the Geogras group, the Jewish officers that helped liberate Algiers. And despite Moncef Bey protecting Jews during the war, Giraud accused him of collaboration and deposed him. He then brought in Mohammed VIII, yet as a ruler, he largely kept out of the public sphere. Giraud also refused to reinstate the decree which made Algerian Jews French citizens. Otherwise, he continued to almost work against the Allies in many regards. Like he kept his own intelligence network, and often acted without informing them. To make matters even more complicated, there was also de Gaulle, who led his own armies. The two did create the French Committee of National Liberation to present a more unified front, but Giraud was outmaneuvered and eventually forced to step aside, leaving de Gaulle to run it alone. Hitler meanwhile reinforced Tunis, but this proved to be a costly mistake. Many of their best fighting men were lost for nothing there, as in May 1943, the city fell to the Allies. From here they would launch their invasion of Italy and bring about the fall of Mussolini. However, the French brought with them a number of African troops, and here many atrocities were committed. Like after the Battle of Monte Cassino, the Italian civilians were subject to mass rape by Moroccan soldiers. Although some Axis propaganda exaggerated the stories, it was concluded over 2,000 women were raped, the youngest at 11, the oldest at 86. Dozens died. 600 men suffered the same fate. Some, however, continue to put the number much higher than this, and thousands of other cases would also occur in occupied Germany as well. Although there were of course instances of abuse on all fronts, historian Norman Neymark claims that the numbers attributed to the Moroccans puts their crimes proportionally on the same level as those of the advancing Red Army. And sticking to this Red Army, in early 1943 they had crushed the Nazis at Stalingrad and moved on to liberate cities like Kursk. With the tide of the war now completely turned, the Allies held many conferences to discuss the future of the conflict and the post-war world. Most of these conferences took place in the Islamic world, like the Casablanca Conference, where the Allies decided that they would not allow the Germans to sue for peace, and they'd keep on fighting until they surrendered. Mohammed V attended the conference, as too did Charles de Gaulle. And interestingly for North Africa, Roosevelt spoke in favour of independence, but said to the French, "The number of Jews engaged in the practice of professions, law, medicine, etc., should be definitely limited to the percentage of the Jewish population in North Africa. This plan would further eliminate the specific and understandable complaints which the Germans bore towards the Jews in Germany." There would be another conference over in Cairo, where Roosevelt and Churchill met Chiang Kai-shek late in the war to discuss their policies regarding Japan. There would then be another conference in Cairo shortly afterwards, where Churchill tried but failed to get Inonu of Turkey to enter into the conflict. Roosevelt, on the other hand, believed that Turkey was still too weak to defend themselves, and the loss of Turkey would prove to be too disastrous to the war effort. Inonu, though, did promise to join the war once he had fully rearmed. He also managed to come away with what he wanted. He had long feared Stalin's claims to the Straits and parts of Turkish lands, and Inonu got assurances from Britain and America that they would stand by them if the Soviets invaded. Possibly the most important conference took place in Tehran though. Here Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt discussed Turkey's entry into the war and the possibility of giving them the Dodecanese and Crete. There were of course a number of other issues in Europe, like opening up another front to alleviate the pressure on the Russians. Plus, as the conference was in Tehran, they did decree that the war has caused special economic difficulties for Iran, and they all agreed that they will continue to make available to the government of Iran such economic assistance as may be possible. But this conference in Tehran may well not have taken place, as earlier in the year, Otto planned on starting a rebellion within Iran. Just like during the First World War, the Germans again targeted the Kashkai nomads as a potential ally. They then began flying in agents from their new bases in Russia and Ukraine. However, British intelligence quickly found out and arrested many of them. So, Operation France was a complete failure. But, according to Soviet intelligence, Otto Skorzeny had bolder plans with Operation Big Jump. Here he planned on leading a group of men himself in Iran, and then assassinating or capturing the big three leaders. But the Western powers believed that this plan was a total Soviet fabrication. Yet, while the great powers were planning on dividing the world, there was a growing number of people who were demanding full independence. For instance, in February 1943, Farhud Abbas published the Manifesto of the Algerian people, demanding to become an autonomous state in a federation with France. This state would also grant equality and freedoms to all religions. He had the support of prominent nationalists like Masali Haj, and they formed a political party, the Friends of the Manifesto and Liberty. But Charles de Gaulle rejected it outright. Otherwise exiled Moroccan nationalists Belefrej and Al-Farsi founded a brand new political party of their own, known as Istiklal. They too published their demands in the Proclamation of Independence of Morocco. This was first submitted to the Sultan, and they argued the allies who shed their blood for the cause of liberty stated in the Atlantic Charter that all peoples have the right to self-determination, to govern themselves by themselves. Moroccan independence was also seemingly supported by the Americans as well. For instance, even agreeing to hold a conference in Casablanca, according to historian Hassan Orid, recognised the Sultan's sovereignty over Morocco. The head of the French protectorate had not been invited to the dinner, further stressing the US position in terms of Morocco's independence. And according to the future king Hassan, Roosevelt said, 10 years from now, your country will be independent. Yet in Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba had been freed from prison, but rather than make his demands right away, he first fled to Cairo. More strangely though was the case of Libya. The Italians had been chased out of their colony, and now the French and the British divided their lands under their occupation. The British put most of their hopes in Idris, the leader of the Senussi. They believed that although he had lived in exile for many years, he still had a lot of influence in the country. He, after all, had created an army of Senussi exiles in Egypt to help the Allies, and held meetings with Libyan sheikhs to drum up support for his claims. In return for this, in 1942, Anthony Eden promised that the Italians would be removed from Libya forever. But now, with the Italians gone, they needed to decide what to do next. Some like Hoya Miller put it bluntly, saying that they needed to be friendly with Italy and make us of her for our own purpose as a bastion of democracy in the Mediterranean, while Viscount Samuel Hood proposed handing Fezzan over to France in order to compensate them for their impending losses in the Levant. So, in late 1944, RDH Arundel was sent to investigate the situation on the ground. He, like many others, saw a nation divided, with distinct identities in Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. Those in Cyrenaica he described as backward and ill-educated, while the majority of the population are semi-settled tent dwellers. The Cyrenaicans could not possibly stand alone. He also said that the region has no intrinsic value for a foreign power except for its geographical position, but again thought it could be turned into the western bastion of the Middle East. In his opinion, they were more open to welcoming Idris as a leader, and even would welcome the presence of British troops for economic reasons. Tripolitania, on the other hand, he argued, was more diverse and would fight against any return of Italian troops. But, he also said, most intelligent Tripolitanians realize that they cannot hope to stand alone. So, Libya could have been divided up again. As to who would protect them, he believed they would look to the east, to Egypt, the Levant and the Arab League, rather than to the west, and the shackles of French colonizing methods. And here he is referencing the recently created Arab League, which could well have united most of the Islamic world into a powerful state. The British and the French, though, continued to station troops in nations like Iraq and Syria. Prime Minister Nouri in Iraq largely remained on the Allied side, but in Syria, the pro-French Prime Minister, Taj al-Din al-Hassani, died in 1943, and this forced the French to call for an election. Prominent nationalist Al-Atassi refused to stand, believing it would be seen as dealing with the French, but he did offer his support to Sukri al-Kuwatli, who was equally anti-French, having financed Syrian revolts since the 1920s. Then there was Lebanon, where Bachara al-Khoury came to power that same year. As a Maronite Christian, it may have been expected that he would continue to align with the French, but after serving many years in parliament, he founded the Constitutional Party and demanded independence. The French arrested him along with other nationalists like Riyad al-Sol and Camille Chamon, but protests erupted, they were freed, and they won the election that year. Importantly though, Khoury was a Christian, while Riyad al-Sol was a Muslim, and the country at that time was equally divided, with around 51% being Christian, 42% being Muslim, and the rest were Druze and the likes. So to create unity, they drew up the National Pact. They agreed that the Christians should not align with the Europeans, and the Muslims should not champion unity with Syria. They also proposed that power be broken down by religion. So the president should always be a Maronite, the prime minister a Sunni, the speaker of parliament a Shia, the deputy speaker a Greek Orthodox, while a Druze should be in control of the armed forces. This was expected to be a great achievement, with all sides uniting to share power, and initially it may be true, but Christians were given too much power, and over time Muslims would outnumber them, leading to a civil war decades later. But for now it held, and as soon as he won the election, Khoury declared independence and joined the calls for the formation of the Arab League. The Syrians, on the other hand, would have to wait until the British invade the country and demand that the French recognise their independence. Towards the end of World War II, many Arab leaders were looking at what a post-war world would be like, and the possibility of Arab unity. In fact, the British had even put forward the idea in 1941, with Anthony Eden saying, "It seems to me both natural and right that the cultural and economic ties between Arab countries, yes, and the political ties too, should be strengthened. His Majesty's government, for their part, will give their full support to any scheme." But the British and many Arab leaders had conflicting plans. Churchill, for instance, said to Eden, "We should try to raise Ibn Saud to a general overlordship of Iraq and Transjordan." Eden, though, continued to believe in a federation which would include some sort of Jewish state. Ibn Saud, meanwhile, had lost his trusted British advisor, St. John Philby. Ben-Gurion, the future Israeli leader, even met Philby in 1937, and allegedly said, "Properly managed, Mr. Philby's scheme offers an approach which should not be abandoned. This plan that they speak of would have seen Zionists become part of a larger confederation headed by Ibn Saud. But also, Palestine should become home for all refugees, not just Jewish, and it could well have seen the deportation of all Arabs from Palestine in exchange." Philby, though, ran for parliament for the fascist British People's Party and was arrested for being a suspected traitor. Otherwise, Harold McMichael, the High Commissioner for Palestine, also believed the British, French and Americans should almost share responsibility for the region initially, but claimed the division of Syria was unnatural and therefore also pushed for a federation. Or H.A.R. Gibbs said, before entering a union, the whole region should be broken up into equal parts like Basra and Damascus to make sure that they were all equal, and the various royals of the Middle East would all get their own little state. Abdullah of Jordan was quick to champion his own claims to take over a unified Syria in late 1942, while also pushing for a union with Iraq. But in Iraq, Prime Minister Nouri was coming up with his own plans. He believed that Arabs needed to unite to recreate their ancient glory and to progress in the path of civilization in freedom and peace. He sent a report to the British detailing his plans for Arab unity in the Blue Book, which included a federation of a Greater Syria and Iraq. This plan was also sent out to the leaders of neighbouring Arab states, and they agreed to meet in Alexandria in 1944. However, Ibn Saud wrote to the British complaining of Nouri's plans to place an Iraqi region, Abd al-Ilah, on the throne of Syria, while Abdullah of Jordan tried to move the Congress to Amman in order to push for his own claims. But it was the Egyptians that were able to take over the Congress, and here Mustafa al-Nahas was the Prime Minister. He had come back to power after the Abdeen Palace incident of 1942, and by most reports, he was a pretty poor and corrupt leader. For instance, the US ambassador said, "His ignorance is as colossal as it is appalling." Yet, argued, "We can get anything which we want from him if we are willing to pay for it." Nahas, though, managed to take over the cause of Arab unity and push forward an Egyptian version of the Arab League. After all, Egypt had not been mentioned in any of these plans, but a unified Syria and Iraq on his doorstep would have reduced Egypt's prestige internationally. So, in the Alexandria Protocol, they agreed that Lebanon should remain independent and that all members should defend the rights of the Palestinians. The League was also formed of independent Arab states represented on an equal footing, and their goal was to protect their independence and sovereignty against every aggression by suitable means. This, however, was pretty disastrous to the idea of Arab unity. Nahas had managed to end the possibility of Nouri, Abdullah or Ibn Saud realizing their plans for a large unified Arab state, and thus it put Egypt at the center of the Arab League, which was founded the next year, while the other states remained divided and contending for power. Nahas, though, wouldn't last too long afterwards. Miles Lamson, the British ambassador, had put him in power and largely kept him there, as he continued to despise King Farouk. In fact, Lamson even once discussed removing Farouk from power, but everyone ignored this. King Farouk, on the other hand, believed that Nahas had too much power and while Lamson was away, had him removed in late 1944. In early 45, Farhud then met with Roosevelt on the USS Quincy, and along with Churchill, Roosevelt told Farhud to make reforms, as nowhere in the world were the conditions of extreme wealth and extreme poverty so glaring. Then the Allies encouraged Farhud to formally declare war on the Axis in order to gain a seat at the United Nations. This though was an incredibly unpopular decision, and the new Prime Minister Mahir was assassinated by a member of the fascist Young Egypt Society after delivering the news. Mahmoud al-Nokrashi Pasha replaced him, and fortunately for him, he was met with new ambassadors. This is because over in Britain, Churchill was voted out of power, and the Labour Party were far less colonial and wanted to improve relations with Egypt, so even removed Lamson from the country. Nokrashi was replaced for a while by the former dictator Sidki, and he tried to solve the major issue of Sudan, which was still under joint Anglo-Egyptian control. But he failed to get British approval for full annexation, and thus resigned, and Nokrashi was brought back in. At the same time, the Zionist movement was gaining more allies in the world, as the Soviet Union joined America in supporting the cause. Ivan Maysky, the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, visited Palestine in 1943, and there he saw the kibbutz and many labor organizations. He therefore began to believe that Zionism represented a progressive trend in contrast to the reactionary Arab neighbors. Yet on the other end of the political spectrum though, there were still the revisionist paramilitaries. Here Menachem Begin, the leader of Irgun, and Yitzhak Shamir, the leader of Lehi, began to coordinate with each other against the British. Begin had studied the Irish War of Independence and believed that a guerrilla war was the best way to humiliate the British, create sympathy for his cause, and ultimately chase the British out. In February 1944, they began their revolt by bombing the offices of the Immigration Department, the department which had stopped Jewish refugees from entering Palestine. Leahy then joined in by shooting policemen and the British resident minister. This all could have ended the Zionist cause and turned public opinion against them. So Ben-Gurion and the more moderate paramilitary, the Haganah, joined the British on what was called the hunting season. In short, the much larger paramilitary began to attack the revisionists throughout the year. Begin, however, refused to fight back, believing rightfully that a degree of restraint would gain him favour in the country. So while Haganah were successful, they were seen as collaborators, targeting their fellow Jews. This fight continued until 1945, when even the moderates became aware that the British were not going to give them a state at the end of the conflict, so the two Jewish sides began to cooperate. The Nazis and the Mufti, meanwhile, made one final play to take Palestine, with Operation Atlas. A few German soldiers were sent to parachute in with weapons and start a rebellion. This force included some who had been part of the German Christian Templar Society that had established colonies there decades ago, as well as Arabs like Hassan Salama. His son, by the way, was Ali Hassan Salama, who was Chief of Operations of Black September, a group responsible for many hijackings, assassinations, and the Munich Olympics massacre. The members of Operation Atlas, however, were quickly arrested. In later history, Israeli historians have claimed that their plan was to poison the water supply of Tel Aviv and kill 250,000 people, but there's no great evidence for this. Elsewhere, just before the war ended in Turkey, Inonu made serious moves to align himself with the Allies. This is because the Soviets were already pushing on Berlin, and he was worried that they would turn onto Turkey next. So he declared war on the Axis in early 45 and was welcomed into the UN. But possibly more important, within his country he arrested the pan-Turkist and Axis supporter Nahal Atsiz, along with many of his supporters. All of them were accused of racism and treason, but really this was just a move to further improve relations with the Allies. Many were also later released, as it was argued many of their views in favour of Turkish identity were not opposed to the constitution of the country, and the pan-Turkish movement continued to grow. Inonu would soon even allow for the people to vote in the first multi-party elections shortly after the war, sensing that political upheaval would be inevitable. One of the causes for such rifts came from a controversial land bill, which would have redistributed land to farmers. This angered many politicians who themselves owned land, and they were joined by politicians who opposed such a status policy and the government's mishandling of the economy thus far. So, under the likes of Salal Bayar, they founded the Democrat Party. They ran against Inonu in 46, but lost in a landslide, possibly in a fraudulent election. And it should also be said that Inonu began to backtrack on many of his policies, some of which may appear almost Maoist. Like in 1939, he had created people's rooms, which were community centres aimed at promoting Kemalism and in order to provide an education to many people in the countryside. These had helped educate tens of thousands of people, but there was a growing sense of anti-communism, and soon they would all be shut down. Otherwise, Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia also recognised the importance of a foreign ally in the post-war world, and for that he turned to America. They already had oil concessions in his country, while Roosevelt argued the defence of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defence of the United States. The two met in early 1945, and there Ibn Saud agreed that America could use Saudi airspace. Yet, while discussing Palestine, Ibn Saud argued that the Jews should be given living space in the Axis countries which oppressed them. The war in Europe, though, ended that May, and while Europe was divided, the Islamic world was left almost in limbo. For starters, the Syrians had been promised their independence, but the French still hadn't left, despite many protests. They also watched on in worry as France began to reassert their colonial position over in Algeria. There, Farhud Abbas's party of nationalists had continued to grow, and thousands protested for more rights and independence. Then on May 8th, as people celebrated the end of the war in the towns of Sétif and Guelma, they clashed with the French settlers. Violence in the two towns spiraled out of control, so the army was called in, and along with legionnaires, Moroccans and Senegalese, they carried out a number of executions. Many villages were then bombed, and settlers lynched the prisoners. In the end, it's believed up to 20 to 30,000 Muslims were killed, although this number is disputed. General Henri Martin correctly predicted that the violence wouldn't end here. "I have secured you peace for 10 years. If France does nothing, it will happen again. Only next time it will be worse and maybe irreparable." So, over in Syria, when de Gaulle planned on establishing a naval and air base in the country, the protests intensified. More protests left French soldiers dead, and the violence spread. This resulted in possibly one of the more odd events of the period, called the Levant crisis. The French brought in more troops, killed many in Hama, and then even shelled Damascus. They even broke into the Syrian parliament, hoping to arrest al-Quwatli, but he managed to escape. Senegalese troops in particular committed a number of atrocities, looting and dumping bodies in mass graves. French officers like Paul Baynet summed up the situation saying, "The Damascus abscess must be lanced." Yet Quwatli and the Syrians found an ally in Churchill. He already didn't like de Gaulle, arguing that he was one of the greatest dangers to European peace. While even Truman, the new US president, said those French ought to be taken out and castrated. So when the French refused to stop, Churchill, who was just about to lose his position as Prime Minister, ordered the British Army in, almost starting another war. The French army in Syria was already in a weak state, as many of the Arabs had abandoned them, forcing them all to surrender without a fight. De Gaulle said, "We are not in a position to wage war against you, but you have betrayed France and betrayed the West. That cannot be forgotten." He believed that this was all part of a British plan to take over the countries. However, Quwatli was brought back in, and their independence was finally recognised. Nearby, the British continued to make it apparent that they would not grant the Jews a state. So the Haganah Lehi and Irgun launched joint attacks for the next 10 months. For instance, November the 1st, 1945 was dubbed the Night of the Trains, as they attacked railway lines and stations. Or June 16th, 1946 was the Night of the Bridges. Through Operation Agatha in June 1946, the British were able to arrest many leaders, including Moshe Sharat, who would soon be Prime Minister. But the Jewish paramilitaries would launch their most infamous attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where they killed 91 people. Bernard Montgomery declared that the British were facing a cruel, fanatical and cunning enemy, and there was no way of knowing who was friend and who foe. General Evelyn Barker, however, caused further resentment as he banned all of his troops from visiting Jewish businesses, infamously saying, "They will be punishing the Jews in a way the race dislikes as much as any by striking at their pockets and showing our contempt of them." However, all of this came shortly after the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry had published a plan for the future of the region. Truman was already keen to send 100,000 Holocaust survivors to Palestine, while Britain's Clement Attlee wanted joint responsibility for the region and an inquiry before any resettlement. They interviewed a number of people, including Holocaust survivors, who overwhelmingly preferred to be settled in Palestine. While one member of the committee, Frank Adelot, said, "I left Washington pretty strongly anti-Zionist. But when you see at first hand what these Jews have done in Palestine, the Arabs are not equal to anything like it, and would destroy all that the Jews have done." So with this sort of mentality, the committee recommended that 100,000 Jews immediately be sent to Palestine, while other countries should help rehome the other Jewish victims. So with this mentality, they recommended 100,000 Jews should immediately enter Palestine, while other countries should help rehome the remaining Jewish victims. Also, Palestine should not be a Jewish nor an Arab state, and any future government should protect all faiths. Obviously, much of the Jewish-owned land would become part of a Jewish state, and it should be said that a great deal of this land had been purchased for decades, even during the days of the Ottoman Empire. King Abdullah of Jordan even said, "The Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in weeping about it." However, to end the violence, they agreed that the UN should take over the mandate. The UN would then work to improve the standard of living and the economic power of the Palestinian Arabs. But they knew neighbouring Arab states would fund more violence, and the Jewish paramilitaries wouldn't stop their attacks either. For this, the British demanded that the Americans help out in quelling any other uprisings. There were, by the way, a couple other plans that were put forward, like the Morrison-Grady plan, which allowed the communities to exercise self-rule under British oversight, while Jerusalem and Negev would remain fully British, and the Bevan plan, which wanted to expand UN trusteeship for 5 more years, and then create an assembly of Jews and Muslims to rule. But these two plans were rejected by both groups. At the same time, many Jews were fleeing to Palestine illegally. The British stopped thousands of them from entering and interned them in camps on Cyprus, while in Palestine, the Jews had actually managed to expand their lands incredibly quickly by establishing 11 new settlements in Negev in just one night in October. The Allies, though, were still convinced that there was a solution, despite the recent Jewish violence and hotel bombings. Ben-Gurion, eager to keep the world on side, condemned the attack, saying Irgun were the enemy of the Jewish people. However, in private, Weizmann reportedly said, "I can't help feeling proud of our boys." The Haganah instead just refocused their efforts on bringing in illegal immigrants, while the Irgun and Lehi continued their attacks on the British. Like in December 1946, on the night of the beatings, they kidnapped and flogged British soldiers. And in July 1947, the Sergeants' Affair saw them capture British soldiers and hang them. In retaliation, British troops killed Jews in Tel Aviv, and in British cities, people attacked Jewish businesses and synagogues. It should also be said that anti-Semitic attacks grew across the Islamic world. Like in Egypt, the Young Egypt Party, a Muslim brotherhood, organised demonstrations, violence broke out, and 5 Jews were killed. Or in Tripolitania, which was still under British control, rioters left 4,000 Jews homeless. But these were about to intensify across the Islamic world in 1947, as the British Parliament voted to hand Palestine over to the UN, and they, in turn, passed a resolution agreeing to partition the country. But before getting onto that, I should mention developments elsewhere, as the Soviet Union had been increasingly aggressive in the region. For starters, in Turkey in June 1945, they demanded the establishment of Soviet bases along the straits. That year, newspapers like Pravda published articles arguing Georgians have earned the right to submit its rightful demands. we appeal to the world public opinion about ancient lands Turkey has seized from us. This was essentially the Soviet Union claiming land stretching all the way to Trabzon, and this obviously panicked the Turks. They would grow closer to the United States, and within a few years, they would even join NATO. The Soviets, on the other hand, were also looking to expand their domains into Iran as well. They had, after all, invaded during the war, but were not prepared to step away entirely. They instead created two puppet states in the north, the Republic of Mahabad and Azerbaijan. Mahabad was created in Kurdish lands and led by Qazi Muhammad. He had actually ruled the lands for a few years under Soviet occupation, having been a jurist and the leader of the Society for the Revival of Kurdistan, while in Iranian Azerbaijan, Jafar Pishavari founded the Democratic Party in Tabriz and pushed a pan-Turkist agenda. They implemented the usual socialist reforms like free education, but both the Kurds and Azeris were focused on promoting their own cultures and languages, something that the Soviet Union had long went against inside their own borders. And although some reforms may have been popular, land reforms and the dismantling of tribal powers simply angered too many locals. This then is when Mustafa Barzani came back into the picture to champion the Kurdish cause. After failed rebellions in Iraq, he fled across the border during the war and became the Minister of Defense of Mahabad. The Iranians, meanwhile, complained to the newly formed United Nations. Resolutions were passed to solve the Iran crisis, and they simply pressured the Soviets to withdraw. In all likelihood, the USSR had just completely overestimated their own position and support in the region, while underestimating the reaction of the United States. And this crisis was probably the first real incident that demonstrated the start of the Cold War. While the Soviets pulled out, the economies of the new states collapsed and the Iranians quickly moved in. They hanged Qazi Muhammad in the square and destroyed Kurdish books, while in Azerbaijan they assaulted many women and killed hundreds of people. Barzani and many others tried to fight on before fleeing to Iraq and then to the Soviet Union. While back in his native Iraq, the founding members of the Kurdish Democratic Party elected him as their new leader. Iran then began receiving a great deal of aid from the United States, and once again they survived partition. But in neighbouring Afghanistan, the country which had been at peace for some time comparatively was in turmoil once again. Back in the late 20s, Mohammad Nadir Shah had ended the civil war, but didn't, as expected, hand over power to the deposed Shah Amanullah. Within the country there were many who still supported the exiled king, including Mazrak, the chieftain of the Zadran. By 1944 though, Mohammad Nadir had died, and his young son Mohammad Zahir ruled Afghanistan. That year, Mazrak led the Zadran in open rebellion, starting yet another civil war. Mazrak would even try to invade the British Raj in 44, looking to unite with other Pashtuns, but he was quickly driven back. His father, by the way, was Babrak Khan, who had taken part in many rebellions before. There were, of course, a number of other listed causes of the war, including new conscription laws, heavy taxation, failing harvests, and a great deal more. As such, other tribes joined in, like the Safi and Mangal, who decided to elect their own king, a man named Salamai. They even tried to link up with a local hero of sorts, known as Fakir Ipi. He was a leader in Waziristan who had long fought against the British. And this move could have seen the creation of a brand new Pashtun state through the Banu Resolution. Remember, at this time the British were pulling out of India and set to partition the lands. The Pashtuns would be given a vote on whether to join India or Pakistan. The Banu Resolution, which was put forward to the British, hoped to give the Pashtuns a third option, the right to join another nation, Pashtunistan. The British, however, refused this, and the Afghan government began bombarding rebel positions, forcing them to surrender by late 1946. The government then proceeded to exile tribe members that had taken part, like the Safi, in what some have called a campaign of ethnic cleansing. The king, though, had remained in power, and with the British now gone, the great game had finally ended, but a new contest emerged. In 1947, the Indo-Pakistan War broke out, and this was something that Afghanistan would take advantage of. They had long voted against Pakistan joining the United Nations, and continued pushing
for the creation of Pashtunistan, hoping to expand into it themselves. As such, there's many reports of Afghan agents working in Pashtun lands, distributing money and weapons to tribal leaders. In 1950, Pakistan even claimed that Afghan troops crossed into their country before being chased back. Then, going back to Mazrak, his brother actually assassinated Liaquat Ali Khan, the first Prime Minister of Pakistan. However, he was also killed in the attacks, so his motives have never been fully understood. Some believe it was the Soviets, or maybe even part of a Pakistani coup, or, of course, an Afghan mission. However, we will leave the partition of India here and go back to the Levant, where another partition was ongoing. Once the UN took over the mandate, they quickly dispatched a special committee to decide on exactly what to do once again. Yet, it should be said many like Norwegian WWII, the first Secretary General of the UN, were keen on partitioning the country from the start. Also, the Arab Higher Committee refused to work with the UN members. But the Jewish councils launched a huge propaganda campaign, welcoming UN members with flowers and cheering crowds, and giving tours of their enterprises. The Jewish leadership had also reportedly bugged hotel rooms and sent out female agents to monitor the committee. While in some Arab settlements, the people were evacuated in order to stop anyone from working with the UN, or in the cases the UN did meet the Arabs, they were booed in Histat. In the end, though, many members of the committee were appalled by the prevalence of child labour in Arab settlements, and really just the general poverty. Even the Iranian ambassador Entazam said, "What asses the Arabs are. The country is so beautiful and it can be developed. If they gave it all to the Jews, they would transform it into Europe." The committee then met with some Arab leaders as well, like Riyad al-Sal of Lebanon and Abdullah of Jordan. In the case of Abdullah, he had allegedly hinted that he should take over the Arab half of Palestine, while in Lebanon it was said in private that Maronite Christians accepted partition, but in public they spoke out against it. Regardless, the committee agreed to partition the lands according roughly to the populations. But Jews, who only made up 32% of the population, were given over 56% of the land. Then they agreed that an international zone would be made around Jerusalem. This was then brought to vote in the United Nations, where 72% of countries voted in favour, including France, the USSR and America. Britain, China and Yugoslavia abstained, while the Muslim world, India, Greece and Cuba voted against it. Of course, this caused outrage across the Middle East, and riots broke out almost everywhere. To give some examples, in Bahrain, crowds marched into the small Jewish quarters of Manama and ransacked shops and synagogues. In Aden, over 100 people were killed, mainly Jews, and in Aleppo, 75 Jewish people were killed. While in Palestine, violence had already flared up again. Bombs detonated across the country, rioting broke out, and both sides murdered one another. To contend against the Jewish paramilitaries, the Palestinians created the Army of the Holy War, led by Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini and Hassan Salama. The Mufti was above them all, but here he made a crucial mistake. One of his allies, Anwar Nusabeh, revealed that the Mufti was only willing to arm his loyal supporters, leaving his forces very, very small. However, this also brings me to a pretty controversial issue, and that's the ties between Nazi war criminals and the new Arab states. Egypt in particular became home to many Nazis, like Johann von Leers, who had converted to Islam and later became an advisor to General Nasser. He was joined in Egypt by potentially up to 6,000 other Nazis, like Otto Ernst Rehmer. He, for instance, claimed, "I know Mr. Arafat quite well. He invited me to eat at his headquarters. I know all his people. They wanted many things from us." And on Yasser Arafat, he was allegedly trained by Otto Skorzeny, an SS commander, who rescued Mussolini and tried to start rebellions in Iran. The FBI even reported one of the most perfidious Nazi agents seems to be the instigator of the recent pogroms in Cairo. Here, they are referring to Adolf Eichmann. Then there was also the head of the Gestapo in Poland, Leopold Gleim, Arthur Schmidt, a general in the Afrika Korps, and Bernard Bender, who ran Jewish interrogation centers in Egypt in the 1950s. Possibly the most infamous in Cairo, though, was Aribert Haim, also known as Dr. Death. In Palestine, Dr. Herbert Pritzker worked alongside the Arabs and said of troops in Jaffa, The Arab Brigade in Jaffa consisted of 7 Germans, 150 Yugoslavs, 30 Egyptians, and 200 Lebanese and Syrians. There were very few Arabs among them. Or, in Fawzi al-Kawakji's army, the Spiegel reported, "They are mainly former soldiers in Rommel's Afrika Korps, escapees from Egyptian POW camps, or Muslim Yugoslavs and Albanians, who Jerusalem's ex-Mufti had previously recruited to a pro-German Mufti brigade." The Spiegel also reported that when the Arabs surrendered in Haifa, the Jews demanded, among other things, the surrender of all Nazi Germans fighting. Many other nations also saw the value of these Nazi veterans. Syria in fact requested 8,000 Bosnians be transferred to their country, and Iraq asked for 2,500. But many of these German officers struggled in the Arab world, and the differences in training. Like General Major Oscar Munsell said, "1,000 times I've tried to beat into their dead heads that pretty paint and big identification numbers do not a fighting panzer force make." Bet Stolsheim, a naval officer dealing with the Egyptians, said, "Oriental sloppiness irritates me again and again, while here they just shake their heads about it, Malayish." But this brings me back to the army of the Holy War. They quickly blockaded Jerusalem, leading many to believe that the Jews would be easily defeated. However, once again, the Arab cause was split. Shukri al-Quwatli of Syria decided on building up his own force of volunteers, the Arab Salvation Army, to advance his own cause. Yet he knew his nation's army was not strong enough, so requested funding from other Arab states. It seemed though that war was imminent, as the Secretary General of Egypt, Azam Pasha, said, "I personally wish that the Jews do not drive us to this war, as this will be a war of extermination. I know that volunteers will be arriving to us as far as India, Afghanistan and China to win." Preparing for this, Ben-Gurion introduced conscription and began acquiring weapons. Fortunately for him, Soviet support allowed him to buy weapons from communist Czechoslovakia, while his agents continued to gather more arms from the huge stockpiles left in Europe after the war. With these, they launched Plan de Lette, a remarkably controversial plan, which was essentially ethnic cleansing. In this plan, he ordered the destruction of villages. In the event of resistance, the armed force must be destroyed and the population must be expelled outside the borders of the state. The Jews, also much like the Arabs, ignored the fact that Jerusalem was supposed to be placed under international control, and Operation Natshon in April 1948 was able to reopen the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road and lift the siege. Also, in these campaigns they continued to commit atrocities, notably the Deir Yassin massacre. This was committed by the Irgun and Lehi paramilitaries, who captured the town after meeting some fierce resistance. They then proceeded to assault many women, kill around 100 people, and paraded prisoners in Jerusalem in front of cheering crowds. In response, the Arabs assaulted a medical convoy and killed around 80 people, mainly Jewish doctors and nurses. The Jewish advances and atrocities, as well as the death of Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini in combat, started yet another controversial point of the conflict: the mass exodus of Arab Palestinians. Almost nobody, however, agrees to why it happened. To try and put this into some sort of context, from 1931 to 47, the Jewish population had rose from 175,000 to 630,000. Yet they were still in the minority, as there were over 1 million Muslims. But by April 1948, already 100,000 Palestinians had fled their lands. Then, when Plan de Lette was launched, more were forcibly evicted, and around 200 villages were destroyed, and the massacres continued. For instance, in May alone, 70 were killed at Ain Zaytun, 200 at Tantura, and 70 more at Abu Shusha. The Arabs also committed massacres, like at Kfar Etzion, where 127 Jews were killed, also in May. All of this pushed more people to flee their homes. Historian Benny Morris has found most villages were depopulated after a Jewish attack. However, others claim that Arab leaders invited them to leave. For instance, John Bagot Glubb, commander of Jordan's Arab Legion, said, "Villages were frequently abandoned even before they were threatened by the progress of war." Or The Economist in 1948 reported on the Arabs fleeing Haifa, "There is but little doubt that the most potent of the factors were the announcements made over the air by the higher Arab executive." The main reason behind such an order, if they gave such an order, was the belief that the Arabs would soon smash Israel and everybody could then return home. As Nouri al-Said of Iraq said, "We will smash the country with our guns and obliterate every place the Jews seek shelter in. The Arabs should conduct their wives and children to safe areas until the fighting has died down." Or Khalid al-Azm, the Syrian Prime Minister, later said of the refugee issue, "We are the ones who encouraged them to leave. Only a few months separated our call to them to leave and our appeal to the United Nations to resolve on their return. Regardless, 300,000 Arabs had left by May, around 1/3 of the population, and that month, the mandate formally ended and Ben Gurion declared Israeli independence on the 14th. The very next day, the neighbouring Arab states invaded. The Haganah had around 35,000 men or so, with a small capacity to produce ammunition. On the other side, the Holy War Army only ever had 1,000 men, and the Liberation Army numbered around a few thousand.
Both of these were also very poorly supplied. Yet now, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Egypt and Lebanon were coming to their aid, and on paper, this may seem like a lot. But the Saudis only ever sent 1,000 men, Yemen around 300, Lebanon 400, Iraq and Syria initially 2,000 each, Egypt 10,000 and Jordan the same. So really, most of these combatants only ever provided very little. And in the case of Egypt, corruption at the time was commonplace. In fact, Hussein Siri Amer, the commander of their forces, was accused of distributing faulty weapons to his men. The strongest Arab force at that time was the Arab Legion of Jordan, which had been trained by the British, although in 1946 the mandate was formally abolished and the Emirate of Transjordan became the Kingdom of Jordan. But King Abdullah had said before he did not intend to resist or impede the partition of Palestine and creation of a Jewish state. He was therefore more concerned about taking parts of Palestine for himself, and even met with Golda Meir before offering to create a Jewish state under his control. Allegedly, he said to the Israelis, "Why don't you wait a few years? I will take over the whole country and you will be represented in my parliament. I will treat you very well and there will be no war." Abdullah also had his disagreements with other Muslim leaders, like he accused King Farrukh of Egypt of not really being an Arab at all. As he said, "You do not make a gentleman out of a Balkan farmer's son simply by making him a king." While in Egypt, Farrukh didn't even tell his Prime Minister Nokrashi of his plans for war until just a couple days beforehand, even though Nokrashi had long advised against any action himself. But Farrukh had provided sanctuary to the Mufti and was fearful of the growing Muslim Brotherhood. So, despite his womanizing and gambling, he began to appeal to the growing Islamist factions. Yet when war was declared, they did unite. Even Abdullah followed the other Arab nations and moved troops led by British officers like Glubb Pasha into Jerusalem, a city which he had long claimed, almost as compensation for his family losing Mecca. However, his forces never went into lands designated to the Jewish state. Farrukh of Egypt, on the other hand, wished to take southern Palestine for himself. Nouri of Iraq still wanted all of the Fertile Crescent. In fact, nearly every leader had territorial ambitions on Palestine and did not want to see it become an independent state. Meanwhile, the Israelis got some support from the French, who joined the Czechs in supplying them with arms. And they found some allies in the region. Members of the Druze, Circassians, and even Bedouin communities defected and joined the Jewish forces. While on the other side, Christian Palestinians continued to side with the Muslim Arabs. In fact, these Christians had been some of the earliest and fiercest critics of Zionism. Like the Palestine paper was ran by the Christian El Issa family, and some have said that this paper was crucial in shaping a Palestinian identity. The Israelis, though, were welcoming in refugees at a rate of 10,000 a month, allowing their army to expand to 60,000 men. Then they were sort of saved by the UN, who declared a truce in June, allowing the Israelis to reorganize. However, Arab volunteers from even more countries, including Morocco and Sudan, also began to arrive. The truce then expired in July and the conflict began again. This period of fighting saw even more expulsions, notably in Lydda and Ramla. Here Moshe Dayan would commit further massacres, and tens of thousands would be forced to leave their homes. Another truce was called shortly afterwards. The UN tried to make peace with another partition plan, but war resumed again in October. Through Operation Yoav, the Israelis were quickly able to push into Negev, while Operation Hiram chased the Arab forces out of Upper Galilee. The Arabs, on the other hand, remained divided. The Egyptians, who had moved into Gaza, created the All-Palestinian Protectorate, headed by the Mufti. Abdullah of Jordan refused to recognize them, and in December, at the Jericho Conference, he named himself King of Arab Palestine, and ordered Glub Pasha to disarm all Palestinians in the West Bank. Plus, the decision to appoint the Mufti in power lost the cause a great deal of credibility in the West. As the US stated, he could not be forgiven for his actions during the war. All of this Arab disunity allowed the Israelis to push them from Gaza and even to the Sinai Peninsula that December. The British, though, pressured them to retreat, and in fact nearly joined the war after the Israelis shot down British planes, believing them to be Egyptian. Yet no Arab nation stepped forward to aid the Egyptians, and they were forced to sue for peace in February. It should be mentioned, though, that they continue to have domestic issues. After Prime Minister Meir was assassinated in 1945, his successors began worrying about the Muslim Brotherhood, who maybe had around 500,000 members. The Prime Minister in 1948 was Nokrashi Pasha, and he outlawed the group. But the Brotherhood's leader, Banner, had sent off volunteers to Israel, and they continued to grow in popularity. Then, in retaliation of his crackdown, on December 28th, Nokrashi was assassinated by a member of the Brotherhood. The government in turn assassinated Banner himself in February 1949, hoping to end the issue. But the group just went underground, and they would eventually re-emerge. The Iraqi government was also not safe at home, as demonstrated by the Al-Watba uprising. This began when the monarchy began to discuss extending British concessions, like continuing their control over foreign affairs and military planning. This was signed by a new Prime Minister, Salih Jabir, the first Shiite to have the position. But he wouldn't last long, and Nouri came back into office. He, though, continued to work alongside the British, which may seem a little odd at first. But he was already having to deal with striking oil workers and a growing communist party. The British therefore secured his rule and the Iraqi monarchy. Yet many politicians had been kept out of discussions with the British, and they led protests alongside students and communists who were fighting against mass poverty and the strict class system. Throughout January 1948, the police shot up to 400 people, and martial law was declared to end the protests. The Communist Party of Iraq largely died out afterwards, thanks in part to the arrest and execution of their leaders like Yusuf Salman Yusuf. But the Communists also lost support because they had followed the Soviet Union in accepting the partition of Palestine, losing them a great deal of support. Back to the war, though, the Egyptians agreed to a demarcation line, and for this they were allowed to keep control of Gaza. However, it should be stressed that this wasn't supposed to be a formal new border. Also, the Egyptians refused to open up the Suez Canal or even the Straits of Tiran to Israeli ships for a number of years. The withdrawal of Egyptian troops also allowed the Israelis to push into Eilat the next month and raise the Inc flag. Iraq then withdrew their forces in March, while Lebanon signed another agreement the same month. The Jordanians made peace next. Abdullah was allowed to keep East Jerusalem and the West Bank in exchange for some territorial concessions. Then Syria finally made peace in July, however they too were having problems of their own. Al-Quwatli was still president at this point, but he was facing criticism for the conduct of the war. So too was the Kurdish army chief of staff, Husni al-Zaim. Well, Zaim in March 1949 decided to launch a coup and take power for himself. This was a quick, bloodless affair, and one that has become incredibly controversial. Some have speculated that the CIA were behind it, while the British at the time said that it may have been planned by Zaim for over 2 years prior. His actions after taking power, though, do suggest that he was perhaps too pro-Western. For instance, he quickly signed an armistice with Israel and then gave permission for the construction of the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which had been championed by the Americans. He also freely offered to settle 300 Palestinians in his land, and as a secular leader, he planned on banning the veil and even the fez. However, on the other side, he had formed an alliance with the SSNP, the far-right group led by Antoun Saada. The plan initially was for Zaim to take power in Syria and Saada to go to Lebanon and thus unite the countries. However, Zaim betrayed Saada by telling the Lebanese authorities about his plans, and they subsequently executed him. This move angered one of the generals responsible for the coup, Adib Shishkali. He had been a long-time ally of Saada, and in turn, he led a counter-coup against Zaim and executed him. This coup would bring al-Atassi back to power, but these two leaders had different plans for Syria. Shishkali, like most in the SSNP, favoured a greater Syria, while the growing Ba'athist Party favoured Arab unity, and Atassi began to support for unification with Iraq. Atassi even began to meet with the Iraqi regent Abd al-Ilah and the young King Faisal II. This plan was even supported by Syrian prime ministers like Nazim al-Qudsi, so for a while, unification seemed very possible. However, Shishkali believed that this would see the Iraqis become dominant in his country. He therefore arrested many pro-Iraqi officers and helped topple Qudsi. Al-Atassi tried desperately to form a new government, but Shishkali continued to make demands on leaders. Like he wanted his right-hand man, Fawzi Selu, to become defense minister. So one prime minister who refused, al-Dawabdi, only served 1 day in office before there was another coup. Atassi resigned in protest, allowing Shishkali to take full military control of the country. Newspapers were closed down, political parties were banned, and spies were sent out across the country. Some of those that were exiled were the likes of Michael Aflaq, the founder of the Ba'athist Party, who began to plot against Shishkali from Lebanon. Atassi, on the other hand, was quickly imprisoned. This wouldn't be the only change in power in the region though, as in Lebanon they now had to deal with over 100,000 Palestinian refugees, while their government was incredibly corrupt. Here they used what was called the Zaim system. This allowed politicians to use bribes and force to stay in office, while notable families often remained powerful. For instance, Kamal Jumblat was a Druze whose family had held power for centuries, and he founded the Progressive Socialist Party in 1949. Many other families had their own parties, and at the head of it all was the long-serving president Bachara el-Khoury. He had previously taken power alongside allies like Kamil Shamoun, a Christian, and Riyad al-Sol, a Muslim, and together they agreed to divide power between the religions. Well, in 1949 they executed Antoun Saada, the leader of the fascistic SSNP, for planning on starting a coup. In response, the SSNP assassinated al-Sol, weakening el-Khoury's position. He was then forced to resign, charged with corruption, and replaced with Chamoun. The assassination of al-Sol, though, may well have been welcomed by King Abdullah of Jordan, as al-Sol had been a vocal supporter for the creation of the all-Palestinian government, something which of course would have impeded the king's plans to annex the West Bank for himself. Abdullah, though, was already growing unpopular for annexing the West Bank, and rumours began to spread that he was having secret talks with Israel. In July 1951, he visited Al-Aqsa Mosque and was shot by members of the Husseini family, the same family which the Mufti belonged to. This assassination created a succession crisis in the country. His eldest son Talal inherited the throne, but he had a strained relationship with his father, who often threatened to remove him from the line of succession. The British resident Alec Kirkbride often intervened on Talal's behalf, but strangely, it was because Talal was anti-British. As Kirkbride said, removing Talal from the line of succession would be seen by many as a Machiavellian plot on the part of the British government. It is important to keep in mind though that Jordan, like many countries in the region, depended on foreign aid. As Time magazine reported, Jordan depends almost entirely on a British subsidy of £7.5 million annually to run its government, and its British-trained Arab Legion of 10,000 men. So the rulers of Jordan often just had to oblige. Before his death, Abdullah had even discussed the possibility of uniting with Faisal II of Iraq to solve the issue. Yet the British insisted Talal remained the heir, even when he was receiving treatment for his mental illness. This was possibly schizophrenia, as he would often attack his own family and foreign guests. He was actually in treatment when his father was assassinated, and this left his brother Prince Naif as regent. There were some plans for Naif to take full power, so Talal returned despite never fully recovering. In some later episodes, he would even attack his own queen with a knife. Prime Minister Tawfiq Abu al-Huda called on Parliament to depose the king in 1952, believing he was planning on taking full power. Parliament quickly agreed, and they would crown his son Hussein as the new king of Jordan. Meanwhile, within Israel, many Arabs were left under martial law. There were further expulsions and the likes, raising the total number of Palestinians that fled to 700,000, in an event the Islamic world calls the Nakba. At the same time, the number of Jews grew as displaced Europeans moved there in huge numbers. It's estimated that between 1942 and 1952, a couple 100,000 migrated, mainly from Poland and Romania. They were then joined by tens of thousands from Muslim countries, where there were still around 1 million Jews in total. However, the exodus had already begun. In Turkey, a lot had already left because of the wealth tax and Thrace pogrom. Plus, Turkey was one nation that largely allowed emigration, whereas most Arab states banned it entirely, believing that it would only strengthen the new Jewish state. So between 1948 and 51, another 35,000 Jews left Turkey, nearly half of the total population. In Morocco, 20,000 Jews made the journey to Israel early on. Yet, like with many Turkish Jews, it was reported that the majority wanted to return home but never could. Then in 1948, in the Oujda region, Moroccans began to watch on as some Jews crossed the border into Algeria and then possibly going on to Palestine. Seeing these as possible soldiers in the war, the people rioted and killed a few dozen people. However, the French governor of the region, René Brunel, claimed that the Jews were to blame for inflaming tensions by leaving illegally, but still, more would leave in the 1950s. Real moves, though, were happening over in Iraq. There, Nouri al-Said said to the UN, "Severe measures should be taken against all Jews in Arab countries. There are more Jews in the Arab world outside of Palestine than there are in Palestine. It will breed interreligious prejudice and hatred." So in his country they dismissed Jews from the civil service, boycotted their businesses and the likes. One prominent Jewish businessman named Shafiq Adez was even executed in public before a crowd of thousands. This in turn forced many to flee, often aided by underground Zionist groups. Then a series of bombs went off in the Jewish quarters of Baghdad, prompting the Israelis to launch Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. This was essentially just an operation to airlift as many Jewish people out of the country. However, there is no consensus over who was to blame for the bombings, and many in fact blamed the underground Zionist movement, who possibly hoped to encourage mass migration. And there is actually a history of Israeli groups doing this. Like just a couple of years later, they were caught in Egypt trying to set off bombs. The plan was then to blame it on Egyptian nationalists and thus encourage mass migration, all as part of the Levant affair. Regardless, 120,000, essentially all Iraqi Jews, left within a year. Sticking to Egypt though, they had recently had pogroms, and now their government was also more hostile to their native Jews as well. For instance, Nokrashi said to the British, all Jews were potential Zionists, and all Zionists were communists. Around a third of them left around 1948, and bombings then drove more to leave. In this case though, they were actually set off by the Muslim Brotherhood. As for Yemen, many of their Jews had already left, so they only had around 35,000 in 1947. Then anti-Semitic riots in Aden pushed more to leave, while the Israeli Operation Carpet brought in far more. This began in 1949, and within a year, they airlifted 50,000 Jewish people out of the country. However, over 1,000 Yemeni children that arrived in Israel mysteriously disappeared. This has led to widespread accusations of kidnapping, and more recently, even human experiments. But sticking on Yemen for a moment, as 1948 was a pivotal year for them. Imam Yahya had ruled the country for decades at this point, and he kept his nation isolated from the outside world. For instance, he famously said, "I would rather that my people and I remain poor and eat straw than let foreigners in." So it was only around this time that the country actually started producing their own currency. but there was a growing movement against him in the Free Yemeni movement. This began shortly after their loss against Saudi Arabia in 1934 and continued to grow thanks in part to the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. Early leaders like the poet Muhammad Mahmud al-Zubairi had studied in Cairo and even met the group. Together they made plans on revolutionizing the country, which they deemed the most backwards in the Arab world. As such, they wrote a manifesto which included a return to a pure spirit of Islam, expansion of education, and stronger ties with other Muslim states. Obviously though, this all went against Yahya's isolationism. Yahya managed to arrest many members back in 1942, while even his son Ahmed bin Yahya supposedly said, "I pray to God I do not die before I colour my sword here with the blood of these modernists." However, there were still many tribal issues in the country as well. Ali Nasser al-Qadhi, for instance, led the Murad tribes, and he had long opposed Yahya, even clashing with government troops back in 1929. Well, now in 1948, he had joined the Free Yemeni movement, and they found a new figurehead in Abdallah al-Wazir, a former royal advisor and aristocrat. Al-Qadhi then assassinated Yahya in 1948, and the group placed al-Wazir on the throne. However, Ahmed bin Yahya rallied together tribes loyal to his family and marched on Sana'a. The city was captured and al-Wazir was beheaded. But in return for their support, the new king allowed his allied tribesmen to sack the city. Ahmad then continued down much the same path, keeping Yemen largely isolated, while also looking to expand into Aden and forming a greater Yemen.